At Christmas dinner, my brother told me to pack my bags, that the house wasn't mine anymore. I smiled through tears because he didn't know the deed already was. What began as a dinner dressed in laughter ended as a quiet war over legacy, love, and loyalty, the kind only blood can start, and only truth can end. They say every home's a heartbeat. Ours pulsed beneath chandeliers in China, in rooms lined with portraits that never smiled. The walls of the Montgomery estate had learned to hold secrets the way vaults hold gold, securely, coldly, without question. I grew up believing that silence was the price of belonging. My parents taught it without words, a kind of etiquette that made emotions look like weakness. Father managed investments, mother managed appearances. Between them, they built a kingdom of control, one where dinner conversations sounded more like negotiations. I used to think love meant keeping the peace. That's how manipulation hides beneath politeness, beneath phrases like "don't make a scene, Eleanor," or "your brother needs to lead someday." My brother Adrian was born 3 years after me, wrapped in the kind of celebration reserved for saviors. He was the heir, the son who would inherit the house, the business, the legacy. And I was the quiet one, the daughter who learned early that even brilliance meant little when born into the wrong gender. But I stayed, because love, even when unreturned, has a way of making prisoners out of loyal hearts. By the time I turned 28, our house had stopped feeling like a home. It had become a museum of expectations, where every photo on the mantel was a performance, every compliment a contract. Yet there were moments when warmth broke through like light through cracked blinds. When mother hummed hymns while polishing the silver, or when father left an extra log on the fire without saying why. Those moments made me believe redemption was possible, that maybe someday Adrian would grow into the man they imagined, and I'd finally feel like part of the story. But love built on illusion always demands payment and heartbreak. That Christmas was supposed to be a truce. The first one after father's passing, the first where Adrian hosted dinner at the house we'd both once called ours. Snow fell heavy outside, softening the edges of everything. Inside, the fire crackled like it was trying to remind us that warmth still existed if we wanted it. The table was immaculate. Crystal goblets glowed under candlelight. Mother, dressed in emerald silk, smiled with the sharpness of someone who'd practiced for it. And Adrian, charming, composed, freshly polished by his promotion to CEO, looked every inch the golden son father had raised him to be. When he hugged me, it was brief, the kind of hug that ends before it begins. "You look well," he said. "You too," I replied, though I wasn't sure which version of him I was talking to. The brother who once chased me through the orchard with snowballs, or the man who'd slowly begun to speak to me like a subordinate. Dinner began like tradition demanded. Grace recited, silver clinking softly against porcelain, conversation treading carefully between grief and performance. Mother raised a toast. To family, and to the future Adrian has built for us. The applause came politely, but the words landed like a stone in my chest. The future he had built? The business we both worked for, the estate we both paid to maintain. Had I vanished entirely from her narrative? I smiled anyway, because in this family, truth had never been a guest at the table. After dessert, peppermint pavlova and small talk, Adrian stood. His chair scraped the marble floor like a blade being drawn. He looked at me with the rehearsed calm of someone who'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror. "Eleanor," he began, voice steady, "there's something we need to address." The air shifted. Even the fire seemed to listen. He held his wine glass like a gavel. "I've decided it's time for you to move out. The house isn't yours anymore." For a heartbeat I didn't breathe. Mother's gaze didn't waver. She nodded, slow and approving, like she'd been waiting for this verdict. "It's for the best, darling. Change is healthy." The room blurred. The chandeliers above us glittered like an audience. I felt the sting of betrayal cut through the practiced calm I'd worn my whole life. "Pack your bags." The words echoed, cruel, clinical. The same house I'd poured my inheritance into. The same estate I'd kept afloat through years of financial strain while Adrian traveled, invested, and failed upward. The home that carried my fingerprints on every window and my laughter in every hallway. I wanted to scream, but instead I smiled. Because heartbreak hurts. But humiliation, that teaches precision. "Of course," I said softly, setting down my fork. "If that's what you want." Adrian looked relieved, mistaking silence for surrender, as men like him often do. Mother dabbed her lips with a napkin, whispering, "Such maturity, Eleanor. I'm proud of you." But inside something shifted, quiet but seismic. It was the moment the obedient daughter finally died, and the strategist was born. That night, after the guests left and the snow deepened into stillness, I walked through every room of the house, my house. The portraits watched in judgment as I traced the wood panels with my fingers. In Father's old study, I found the folder he'd left me years ago, sealed, signed, and notarized. It was the deed, the title, transferred to me after his passing, with a single line written in his handwriting. For the one who never asked but always earned. I stood there under the soft hum of the lamp, holding proof that justice had been waiting quietly in the drawer all along. Outside, the snow kept falling, heavy and cleansing. Inside, my reflection stared back from the window, calm, certain, unbroken. Christmas wasn't over yet. And neither was I. Night remade the house into a cathedral of soft noises. The radiators whispered their old prayers, slow heartbeat, and the snow pressed its face against the windows as if trying to read the rooms from outside. In that hush, the deed on the desk was not paper. It was spine. It steadied the parts of me that had spent a lifetime curtsying to people who mistook my gentleness for vacancy. Grief had taught me to walk quietly. Betrayal taught me to walk with aim. The house remembered my steps. It remembered my childhood scuff marks along the corridor, the way I used to count the stair treads like rosary beads, the place on the banister where Father once rested a tired hand after a board meeting that lasted too long and told him less than silence could. So I walked the map of our history with the deed folded against my palm, and I let memory do what it does best when pain needs a witness. It catalogued, it clarified, it cut away what never mattered. There is a method to righteous fury. It does not shout. It sharpens. The first edge is always knowledge. I began with ledgers, the kind most people never read because they do not realize numbers gossip. In Father's study, the oak drawers gave way to files that still smelled faintly of his cologne. A dry cedar note like good advice. Statements lay in tidy rows. Mortgage satisfied, taxes current, maintenance scheduled, reserves healthy. And then the seam where Adrian's fingerprints began. There the lines lost their gait. Small authorizations charged as administration. Disproportionate allocations labeled temporary liquidity. 5 figures here and there moved the way furniture is shifted before a disastrous party. It was not ruin, not yet, but it was a rhythm that didn't belong to stewardship. It belonged to entitlement wearing a suit. I let the truth arrive in order. That is a discipline. I marked dates, traced vendors, matched signatures, and watched a pattern bloom like frost on glass, beautiful if you do not need to breathe. When a page refused to explain itself, I set it aside and listened for its company. Paper, like people, confesses best in context. The second edge is allegiance. A house this size survives on invisible faithfulness. The hands that polish wood that no one thanks, the boots that scrape snow from the steps at dawn, the minds that remember deadlines so lauded sons can remember applause. I learned the house again by the way they moved through it. The chef's footsteps were broad and hopeful, a man who believes good food untangles most knots. The groundskeeper's gate had a winter ache in it. The housekeeper moved like a hymn that knew every verse. These were the citizens of the small nation that keeps legacy from rotting into vanity. I understood, with a clarity that was almost relief, that power is not a chair at the head of a table. Power is the trust with which people offer you their mornings. So I considered how to place my truth into their keeping without asking them to betray themselves. Instructions would be quiet. Documents would speak. Authority would not dress itself as rage. If this was to be justice, it had to look like kindness where it could. The third edge is time. Impulse wanted spectacle. Wisdom wanted symmetry. Christmas had opened a wound in the light. The answer would arrive in the light as well. Not in a backroom scramble but in a room that understood ceremony, law, record, witness. I chose a day that was both ordinary and sacred, 12th night, when the season is meant to turn and the old songs agree to be quiet. It gave me 12 days to turn heartbreak into architecture. 12 days is longer than it looks when you build with precision. Each morning began the same way. At Father's desk with tea that cooled while I did not. A small brass letter opener resting like a slender sword beside the blotter. The deed laid flat as a horizon. I copied, I certified, I tucked away originals in a place the house had taught me to trust. A wall safe disguised as wainscoting. known only to people who stand close enough to surfaces to feel their temperature change. It felt like prayer without petition, only intention. Grief visited as it wished. It arrived not for Adrian but for the years I had spent rehearsing a smaller version of myself to fit inside their idea of a daughter. Grief is a precise teacher when you let it keep the chalk. It drew a line between what I could not fix and what I would no longer endure. When it left, resolve remained like the ring left by a glass on a table, proof that something had been there and would return if invited. There were calls to make. Not the frantic kind, the honest kind. The attorney who had never once spoken to me as if my questions were emotions. The banker who remembered that I was the one who negotiated the refinance during that year the markets wanted to teach us cruelty. The security firm we had used for events, whose director had once told me that discretion is the only currency that does not inflate. Each conversation lived in the same tense we would require on 12th night, present, verifiable, calm. I did not ask for favors. I issued permissions that were already mine to give. Lines were redrawn with ink and with tone. I wrote letters by hand. Not threats, truths delivered with dignity. One to the household staff, thanking them for their faithfulness and telling them that the house would remain their work if they wished it, and that wages and contracts would be honored according to the deed holder's authority, which was mine. One to mother, not mailed, folded into the pocket of a robe she wore every morning, explaining that the house was not a stage for whatever story she needed to tell herself to survive father's absence, and that love would be welcome here again the moment she learned to speak to me as a person rather than a role. Compassion can be firm without apology. I let it be. At dusk on the 4th day, I walked the orchard that had become a shape in my memory rather than an address. Snow feathered the bare branches into an architecture that made negative space feel like invitation. I stood where we used to build our snow forts and pictured the year Adrian and I plotted together rather than against. A person can miss a version of someone who no longer exists without wishing the old harm. I set that ghost down in the snow. It sank without struggle as if relief had a weight. Back inside, the housekeeper had left the tiniest signal on the kitchen island, a sprig of rosemary from the winter garden, set in a tumbler of water like a green candle. Some gestures are louder than speeches. It meant, we see you. We know what is right. We are not afraid of it. I returned the kindness by scheduling inspections, audits, and an inventory that would treat heirlooms as stories, not trophies. If justice is to be healing, it must catalog what will be cherished and what will be released. On the 6th day, the ledgers surrendered their last secret. It lived in a footnote that thought itself small, an encumbrance filed against the estate for a venture that had nothing to do with home. The language was bland, the way dangerous things are when they wear good tailoring. Temporary collateral, it said, as if a house could be borrowed like a sweater. The signature was legal. The audacity wasn't. I did not tremble. I amended. The attorney drafted the necessary corrections with the kind of elegance born from expertise and a clean conscience. Notices would go out on the morning of 12th night. Filings would record what already was. The encumbrance would be lifted. The house would be returned to the legal cleanliness father had intended when he wrote that sentence that still warmed the room when I read it, for the one who never asked but always earned. Some sentences are keys disguised as blessings. They unlock and they absolve at once. On the 7th day, I checked lists twice the way children check chimneys for generosity. Who knew what, who needed to be told, who needed only to feel. The chef would prepare a simple supper that could tolerate interruption. The groundskeeper would keep the drive clear and the gate open to exactly the right degree of welcome. The security team would arrive before dusk, not in black suits as if doom were fashionable, but in quiet winter coats that understood restraint. They would take instruction not from my volume but from my ownership. The 8th day gave me back my appetite. I ate breakfast at the long kitchen table where no one performs because no one is watching, and I read Father's old margin notes in a book about stewardship he kept pretending was about strategy. In the notes he had argued with himself kindly, which is how the wise win. He had written once that legacy is not the story people tell about you, it's the room they enter because you left the door unlocked. I looked up from that line and realized the neatest condition of my revenge. When I reclaimed the house, I would not fortify it against my family. I would simply require that they enter it without costumes. On the 9th day I visited Mother. Not to plead, not to warn, only to look in her eyes and measure whether truth could still live there when it had to share space with her pride. The condo she moved into after father died smelled like lilacs that had lost their insistence. She wore a cream sweater that tried to remember grace. I did not recount Christmas. I did not rehearse injustice. I told her I loved her without offering myself up to be harmed by the way she did not know what love meant. When I left, I knew what I had long suspected. Some absolutions are for the absolver. I breathed easier in the cold. The 10th day brought a thin sunlight, a ribbon of brightness across the marble floor that looked like a promise had been unwrapped halfway. The housekeeper and I walked room by room with a list and a pencil like a wand. We decided what could be put into storage because it told a story that kept us small. We decided what must remain because it taught us that staying can be an act of courage when leaving is only an act of theater. An empty hallway echoed. We let it echo. New sound needs room to practice. The 11th day asked for rehearsal. I spoke the words out loud when no one was there to grade them. Welcome, sit. Here is what is true. Here is what is true. Here is what will happen. Leave if you must. The mirror in the foyer gave back a woman I recognized and had not seen often enough. Eyes steady, mouth kind, shoulders set as if carrying something worth the effort. I placed the deed on the entry table the way one might leave a candle in a window for a traveler who swore he'd never be lost but was. That evening, I ironed a dress I already owned. Revenge does not need new clothes. It needs old promises kept. The fabric fell smooth beneath the iron's small heat, and I thought of all the times I had chosen silence as a currency that did not buy what it promised. I set the iron back in its cradle and watched steam float upward in a soft column like a ghost deciding to stop haunting. 12th night arrived without fanfare. Dawn wore the pale blue of a clean sheet. The notices filed at 9 o'clock did not make a sound in the rooms, but the house seemed to stand a little taller, like a person who has just remembered her true name. The chef lit the stove as if it were an altar. The groundskeeper salted the steps with the care of someone who knows what a misstep can cost. The security team checked in with a nod one can only earn, not demand. Papers waited in a folder on the console table, each page a hinge, each signature a door that would not slam. I did not invite them. I simply told them supper was at 6, and that we would be speaking plainly. Plain is a luxury in houses that worship varnish. The air tasted of rosemary and endings. By 5, snow hummed faintly against the windows. By 5:30, candles burned along the mantel the way constellations hang, both for beauty and for navigation. They arrived as they had always arrived, the way people do when they are certain the rooms belong to them. Mother first, wrapped in the perfume of approval she had chased all her life. Adrian next, with a smile that treated furniture like audience. His new watch announced itself at the threshold, a small glittering clock that mistook itself for time. He spoke my name the way one speaks to a receptionist, pleasant, performative, positioned. The house did not lean toward his voice. It recognized mine. We did not begin at the dining table. We began in the foyer, where truth fits because there are doors on every side and no one can claim a corner. I told them the schedule with the same civility I use when explaining the route to someone who doubts a map. Supper first, then a brief conversation in the study, then the evening our separate ways, sleep for those who have earned it, reconsideration for those who have not. The clock agreed with me every quarter hour, chiming not to rush but to remind. Supper behaved. Plates made their rounds, steam rose and disappeared as if it trusted the room to stay warm, and conversation did that peculiar thing it does when people know they are about to be asked to be honest. It became enthusiastic about harmless topics. I let it. Mercy often looks like patience when it is actually strength choosing its hour. After the dishes were cleared, the study accepted us. The lamp gave the desk its old circle of golden logic. I set the folder down with no flourish. I did not stand behind the desk like a judge. I stood beside it like a daughter who had learned the laws of the house because she wanted the house to stop hurting the people inside it. Paper performed its quiet miracle. Deed. Title. Transfer language with a sentence father had written that still found the exact muscles that lift the chest. Notices of filing. Release of encumbrance. Authorizations for staff and security to take instruction from me, the deed holder. The room did not gasp. That is the kindness of documentation. It spares the body theatrical shocks and gives the mind a steady staircase. Mother understood first. Not because she read faster, but because she recognized Father's handwriting like a weather pattern. Her face did something it had not risked since he died. It admitted surprise without reaching for scorn to cover it. A slow realization moved through her like a tide finding a shore it had been promised and forgotten. The pearl at her ear stopped pretending to be a shield. Adrian did what boys do when the stage directions fail to show up. He rearranged his posture. He tried in disbelief and found it did not fit. He reached for outrage and it slipped from his fingers because the pages offered him no friction. Anger cannot grip the handle of fact when fact has been polished by care. He looked at me then the way men look at weather that will not obey, indignant, then confused, then cold. It did not matter what he felt. This was not his house to interpret anymore. It was mine to shepherd. I did not narrate his mistakes. I did not humiliate. I named the correction. I named the boundary. I named the expectation that lives here now. Respect is no longer decorative, it is structural. He could be inside that architecture if he wished to become load-bearing rather than ornamental. Or he could step outside and test his talent against a climate that does not applaud on cue. Security did not enter the room. They stood where decency stands, close enough to be the spine of a decision, far enough to let dignity keep its face. The staff did not watch. They have their own kingdoms to run, kitchens and corridors and calendars. Justice has the right scale when it does not ask bystanders to applaud. The evening did not end in triumph. Triumph is loud and heady and unstable. The evening ended the way good work does, with air that felt honest in the lungs and a door that closed softly because nobody slammed it. They left the study in the sequence the house taught us as children. Mother first, then the heir, then the one who turned out to be steward and host. In the foyer snow lightened to a fine lace. The night did not need to be told what had happened, could feel the temperature change. Upstairs, in the room where I had pressed dresses for holidays that never offered what their names promised, I stood at the window and watched the drive curve away into the dark. Somewhere out there a boy I had loved in the language of siblings had to learn a new grammar. Somewhere inside these walls a woman who had worshipped the idea of control might consider the holiness of surrender. I did not plan their conversions. I tended my own. The clock called midnight with 12 clear notes, each one both a goodbye and a threshold. The house answered with a settling sigh, the sound old timbers make when they realize they are once again holding up something worth sheltering. On the nightstand, the folder of copies slept like a well-fed cat. In the safe, the originals kept their quiet promise. In the morning there would be letters to post, subscriptions to transfer, codes to reset, flowers to order not for show but for scent. There would be rooms to repaint in colors that did not pretend to be somebody else's seasons. There would be a life to arrange that did not apologize for existing. But just then, in the tender geometry between a justice done and its consequence arriving, there was only a woman in her own house, breathing like someone who had been underwater and had finally remembered how to stand where she could touch the ground. That breath, steady and unafraid, built the bridge to what must come next. And what must come next rarely waits politely. It had already begun to walk up the drive in boots that did not care what ice thinks of ankles. The conflict people bring when truth refuses to rehearse their favorite play. The door would open. The portrait eyes would watch. The deed would stay warm in the wall. And the storm that calls itself family would ask for one more performance. It would not get one. Morning arrived the way truth does after a sleepless night, colorless at first, then undeniable. The house breathed in the pale winter light and declined to pretend that anything was normal. Floors remembered the sound of last evening's departures. Glass remembered the temperature of hands that had gripped it too tightly. The foyer remembered the weight of names that no longer owned it. In that hush, certainty took its seat. The deed was no longer a document. It had become a compass. Conflict seldom knocks. It drafts itself a key. It let itself in by noon. The first sign was administrative, which is to say it wore polite shoes. The family office sent an email addressed to everyone and no one, language crafted to look neutral, the way a blade looks ceremonial when polished. It announced a routine reallocation of oversight, and listed departments that had never existed anywhere, except inside Adrian's need to feel irreplaceable. Words tried their old trick of sounding like structure. The house, older than tricks, did not blink. Precision is not loud. It is exact. The attorney replied with timestamps and filings that had already crossed the courthouse threshold. with the kind of economy that makes bluster look like a hobby. The bank acknowledged the rightful signatory with a sentence that could hold the whole room steady. Insurance updated beneficiaries. Vendors shifted their greetings to the name that had been there all along, as if a radio had finally tuned to the correct station after years of static held together by charm. Rage, when it cannot command the world, tries to rent it. Adrian sent a courier with a stack of letters embossed with the crest he'd always loved more than the values it was supposed to symbolize. The letters instructed the staff to behave as if time could be reversed by stationery. The staff, guardians of mornings, placed the envelopes in a drawer built precisely for things that ought not to disturb the day. The rosemary on the island did not wilt. By afternoon, outrage discovered theater. A column appeared in a society page that pretended not to gossip while doing nothing else. It described a dutiful son besieged by an overreaching sibling, its favorite adjective for any woman who stopped apologizing. It used the word hijack, a melodrama that preferred panic to paperwork. It did not mention the sentence father had written with his hand that still warmed every room it entered. For the one who never asked but room it entered. For the one who never asked but always earned. Headlines are allergic to context. The house isn't. The board of the family company liked to gather on Thursdays. It made them feel like they were practicing liturgy. Adrian called an emergency session for Wednesday, because disruption is a costume that men wear when legitimacy will not dress them. He arrived with a slideshow and the confidence of a person whose mirrors have learned not to argue. He spoke of stability and continuity and the danger of domestic interference, a phrase that tasted like old varnish when it touched the air. Silence in a boardroom is not always consent. Sometimes it's arithmetic. Old directors added up results they could not deny, quarters saved by decisions Eleanor had made when nobody was looking, crises averted by signatures nobody praised because the praise would have had to change direction. Questions that had learned to bow tried standing. They straightened. They stayed up. A vote was scheduled that required less rhetoric and more ink. Numbers have their own weather. It shifted. At home, dignity had tasks. The housekeeper opened the blinds the way she always did, not as performance but as a daily treaty with light. The chef seasoned soup as if heat could be asked to heal and would answer honestly. The groundskeeper salted the east steps twice because a squall was forming that preferred that entrance. Anxiety and wind often share a calendar. The security team moved like calm moving furniture, without spectacle, creating space where a scene had hoped to happen. Memory elbowed its way in because conflict invites it. As papers migrated from drawer to desk to signature, the rooms played their old films. A little girl at a piano hitting the same stubborn bar of a hymn, until the melody finally forgave her. A teenage boy in a new suit practicing approval in a mirror, learning which angle made him look like inheritance. A father pausing on the threshold after another dinner that had been all trophy and no Thanksgiving, placing his hand on the jam as if greeting a friend because the house would never ask him to be bigger than he knew how to be. A mother rearranging a vase for the 6th time because control is an herb some people grow instead of healing. These scenes did not ask for pity. They asked for context, the gentlest accountant and the sternest judge. Late morning tilted toward confrontation, the way a portrait tilts when the wire behind it has been anxiously touched too many times. Adrian arrived without announcing himself, because entitlement believes doors are decorations. He moved through the foyer with an air that asked furniture to remember it had once stood when he entered. Furniture did not. In the study, he found the desk as father had left it and as I had claimed it, neat, honest, busy without frenzy. The folder of copies lay where it always rested now, available, not afraid. He read, not because he doubted their contents but because text is the last place some men go when the theater closes. He tried the old instruments. Magnanimity performed as magnification. He inflated generosity until it became threat, and when the room did not change temperature, he tried injury. Injury announced itself as legacy wronged, a howl dressed in lineage. He wandered toward the piano and placed his fingers on keys he had once tried to play. Sound came out that did not care about his feelings. He lifted his hands and turned to the window, where the orchard kept repeating truth with branches that had learned to say no every winter so they could say yes every spring. He left without slamming anything, which is a kind of learning in itself. By evening, the society page had a sequel. It inventoried miseries that had not occurred, cited sources that had not attended, painted a portrait of a woman drunk on power because that is the only intoxication some people will allow a woman to admit without challenging their own. The portrait neglected to include balance sheets, audits, minutes, amendments, affidavits, attestation. It did not include rosemary in a tumbler or a groundskeeper's careful salt. It did not include rooms that had started to hum again because Liz had been escorted to the coat closet and asked to wait for a ride that would not arrive. Conflict escalates by recruiting chorus. Cousins who had not called in years rediscovered their telephones. An aunt remembered that propriety is a ladder and began climbing it toward my voicemail. A godparent who had attended only when photographers did sent a message offering arbitration, a word that in some vocabularies means, I would like to be necessary. I arranged all of it into an inbox the way one arranges shoes that will not be worn this winter. They could stay. They would not travel anywhere important. The company's vote approached like weather slowly admitted by every barometer. Adrian prepared an address. Addresses are performances that would like to be constitutions. He wore a tie he believed meant victory when sunlight hit it, and he arrived in a car that glittered under street lamps like a promise that knew it was having its last good night. He entered the room and performed tribe. The board watched and performed patience. The minutes did their sacred duty. They measured. When my turn arrived, I brought nothing to project. I brought numbers that did not require eloquence. I brought a record of contracts renegotiated in favor of fairness, because fairness keeps companies alive longer than conquest does. I brought stories of vendors paid on time until loyalty ceased being a slogan and became a habit. I brought the smell of coffee at 7 a.m. in the logistics office where a shy operations manager once cried, because somebody finally said the plan would prioritize people without apologizing to profit. Profit had come anyway, as it often does when not worshipped. I did not bring Father's sentence in my pocket for show. I kept it nearer, under the breastbone where Shock had once lived and learned not to. The vote did not thunder. It clicked. Directors raised their hands like people who had returned to arithmetic after a long detour through myth. The company chose stewardship over spectacle, which is not to say the room broke into hymns. Companies do not sing, but something like a throat unclenched. Minutes etched. A chair changed hands. A season ended without confetti. Adrian did not collapse. Collapses are romantic. He remained upright, which is a different genre of dignity. He shook a hand, not mine, and left a pen on the table because exits need something to forget. Outside, the cold forgave him because winter always forgives the warm-blooded if they keep moving. Inside, the rumor that the earth would stop spinning if his name stopped appearing on reports ceased bothering the furniture. At home that night, the house held its breath in a way that meant it wasn't actually holding it anymore. The air evened. The radiators stopped their extra prayer. The grandfather clock felt justified. I stood in the hall where portraits had learned to avert their eyes and considered whether to replace them. Perhaps not yet. They could watch another kind of story conclude. Loss kept its appointment, because victory without grieving is only rearrangement. I sat on the floor of Father's study with the lamp making that exact circle of gold it had always made, and let the version of my brother I had loved step forward for his honoring. He had once built me a fort out of sofa cushions because snow was forbidden in the parlor, and he wanted me to have a winter anyway. He had once given me the peach from his lunch because mine had bruised in the bag. He had once said I was the only person who understood the exact way he hated silence after our parents fought. That boy could not live here anymore. I kissed him on the forehead without touching air and let him go. Compassion is the only clean exit. Morning brought escalation wearing a new coat, legal zipped to the chin. A petition appeared that tried to reframe transfer as trick, stewardship as seizure, competence as cunning. It asked a judge to ignore the sentence that Father had written as if handwriting were a fashion and could be retired. Paper met paper in the way the good world keeps score without bruising. The judge, who had no time for families that wanted to turn grief into sport, scheduled a hearing and used a tone that reminded everyone that courtrooms were built for gravity, not performance art. In the hours between filing and hearing, Adrian discovered the last refuge of a man falling out of his own myth, the press. Interviews tried to collect him into a story that would sell ads on outrage while pretending to defend tradition. He obliged. Cameras filmed cheekbones learning to carry shame without acknowledging it. Words lined up under lights and paraded as values that had never climbed a staircase to make sure the janitorial staff had heat. The house did not read any of it. Houses lose interest in noise once the load-bearing walls remember what they are for. The night before the hearing, I walked the perimeter of the property until my breath looked like a tender fog. The orchard wore its patient geometry, rose like sentences that do not rush. A fox crossed the snow with the kind of elegance that doesn't ask to be admired. Above, the winter sky opened its quiet ledger and added a star for every time someone had chosen duty without a witness. I stopped at the split trunk that had taught me as a girl that being broken and being widened are sometimes synonyms. I placed my palm on the bark, cold as honesty, and gave thanks without words. Winter understands gratitude that does not need language. The hearing lasted less time than a rumor and did more good. Paper proved. Witnesses attested. Dates lined themselves like soldiers who preferred not to fight. The judge asked 3 precise questions the way a surgeon asks for 3 precise instruments, and then wrote a sentence that felt like the house exhaling. Petition denied. Transfer affirmed. Encumbrance lifted. Counsel chastened for attempting theater in a building where gravity pays the electricity bill. I left not triumphant but oxygenated. Adrian was waiting outside the courthouse because men who build themselves from applause need to be near pavement after verdicts. The ground steadies them when cameras blur. His eyes had learned a new quiet that had not yet decided if it would grow into humility or harden into grievance. That is an apprenticeship only pain can sponsor. I crossed the plaza without offering him the prop of a scene. We existed at the same latitude under the same January sky. The day chose not to pick sides. Simply continued, which is mercy. Back at the house, a delivery arrived from a florist who never wasted color on sincerity. White amaryllis, long and spare. The severity of an apology that refused to explain itself. The card was unsigned, but the handwriting knew how to smile without showing teeth. Mother had always preferred her messages to be legible from across the room. I placed the vase on the piano and let the Blooms consider the keys. If they wished to forgive the instrument for its complicity in old performances, they could. If not, the room would not force their hand. Conflict attempted one more entrance, the way a storm taps a window after the thunder has moved on, just to see if anyone will come back outside for the pleasure of being wet. A private investigator rang at the gate and presented himself as a neighbor concerned for my safety. Security introduced courtesy to suspicion and asked them to be adults. The investigator left with the impression he had encountered a house that knew how to draw a line without shouting it. I spent that evening with lists again, this time not of defenses but of beginnings. The rooms needed new purposes that matched the life they were now privileged to shelter. The small east parlor, always misused as a trophy stable for objects that had never asked to be admired, would become a library for the staff on breaks and for neighbors on snow days when the library in town closed early. The solarium would host winter plants and winter people, elders with stories that hurt when they stayed inside. Students who needed a table that did not judge their backpacks. The dining room would feed more people than the guest list recognized, because hunger does not check invitations. The piano could stay. Music deserved a better employer. News of those decisions floated softly into the neighborhood the way steam leaves a cup on a cold morning. Changed something that tabloids cannot. The way a place is spoken about in kitchens. Ordinary houses adjusted their idea of what the big house on the hill was for. It stopped being a billboard for a family and became a useful building. People forgive wealth when it stops pretending to be a mirror and starts being a window. Conflict felt forgiveness and howled, because nothing frightens grievance like usefulness. A final letter arrived from Adrian that wore regret like a suit that did not fit through the shoulders. It wanted to be contrition and arrived as a calculation. It proposed reconciliation, on terms that would replace fact with truce. Truce is a treaty signed by people too tired to be good. I wrote back 2 sentences. The first was gratitude for the offers he had not known how to make earlier. The second was a boundary that did not negotiate with math. If he wanted to be a brother again, he could begin by paying the vendor he had temporarily delayed during a summer of yachts. I included the invoice number. Some prayers come with routing information. Somewhere in all of this, the house stopped referring to the rooms by what they had been called and started calling them by what they did. The music room became the room where Luz from housekeeping sat after shift, and FaceTimed her sister in Veracruz. The blue bedroom became the room where a board member's Parkinson's tremors calmed enough for him to admit he had been wrong and meant to stay wrong forever, until winter showed him it had other hobbies. The kitchen table became a map table for a charity that placed coats around shoulders whose names would never appear in any society column, except the one that is kept by angels and unbothered cats. By the end of the third week, conflict was no longer escalating. It was residue. It clung, as old perfumes do, to curtains that would need laundering in a season when windows could be opened without the house catching cold. The staff, who measure reality in tasks completed rather than headlines read, had returned the household to its right rhythm. Bills went out, were paid, and thanked in both directions because commerce can be a kind of civility. The groundskeeper rolled a wheelbarrow across late light and did not look at the house as if expecting it to fall. He knew it wouldn't. He had always known. He had simply been waiting for the people inside to earn his certainty. Conflict, unwilling to concede the stage, attempted an encore in the smallest hours. A car idled by the gate 3 nights in a row, windows tinted to the legal limit and the moral one. Security wrote down the plates and declined to be impressed. Cameras recorded boredom. On the 4th night, the idling stopped. Even persistence likes an audience. Denied one, it finds a warmer driveway. When the month turned, I hosted an evening that would not have fit inside any of our old calendars because none of those had space for occasions that were not about us. We called it an open house because houses owe openness to the neighborhoods that forgive their shadows. There were candles but no speeches, soup but no toasts, violins but no arias that would make anyone choke on the memory of being asked to applaud things that hurt them. People came the way people come when the weather says it is safe and curiosity says it might be good. They left their coats in a room that had once kept fur and now kept warmth without shame. In the hall where the portraits lived, we tried a small experiment that did not ask permission from the past because the present is the only authority that can be kind enough to move furniture. We hung beside the oils a framed copy of Father's sentence, the one that had rebuilt everything without making a sound, printed in his hand as large as the painter had made his jawline. People paused. Some smiled. A few cried without embarrassment. One child asked what it meant. The mother said softly, "It means the house knows who loves it." Conflict, after witnessing a child being told the truth in a room that once scared children into good posture, retired for the night. It would wake again because families are weather and weather does not end, it rotates. But its voice would be fog, not storm, and fog is just cloud that forgot how to climb. When the last guest left, I stood on the front steps and let the night settle its hand on my shoulders. The sky had cleared to that merciless winter clarity that makes even regret look honest. Somewhere in town, a printer set type for the next edition of the paper, where the same columnist would try to decide whether kindness or scandal sold more ads. Somewhere in a condo that smelled like lilacs trying to remember, a mother watched a show on mute and wondered whether muting had been her sport too long. Somewhere at a window with a view of his reflection, a man who had loved a version of himself that could not survive law learned to breathe without applause. The house behind me did what houses do when they have been returned to vocation. It waited for footsteps that were coming, not to judge them, only to measure them against the rhythm it had found again. Mine matched. It liked that. The clock agreed. Midnight would arrive soon. It would not be a chapter mark this time. It would be a hinge. Upstairs, in the drawer where I kept paper that mattered, lay another letter I had written and not yet sent. It was addressed to a future I had only just admitted was allowed to include joy. It did not speak of Adrian except as weather in the almanac. It spoke instead of paint colors that did not apologize, of seasonal menus that taught winter to stop pretending it was denial, of scholarships named after people who had never touched marble but had taught it how to behave. It asked little and promised everything that could be kept. Downstairs in the foyer where truths now felt comfortable taking off their coats, the deed rested inside the wall, warm as a small sun. It would not be invoked in every conversation. That was not its purpose. It would beat quietly, the way a heart does when it is done proving itself. And when the next storm announced itself with the perfumed confidence of someone who believed they knew the ending, the house would do what it had learned in Act 3. Refused to lie, refused to bow, hold, and hum. Beyond the gate, tire tracks in the snow turned toward town. In the morning, they would carry a new rumor, not about scandal, not about coups, but about soup shared and portraits listening and a sentence written by a hand steady enough to sign off on mercy. Rumors like that are not rumors. They are beginnings. And beginnings, as every house that has survived a winter knows, are just conflicts that have resigned. Snow softened the edges of consequence, but inside the house, edges declared themselves. It is one thing to win. It is another thing to live inside what winning asks of you. I learned that power has a pulse, and it expects you to keep time. Every day after the hearing, the rooms made a quiet request. Do not let this become about triumph. Let it become about truth that can be born. Letters multiplied, as if paper had decided that repentance and resentment should arrive in equal envelopes. Some days began with apologies that had clearly asked mirrors for help. The sentences were well-groomed, the remorse perfumed, the grammar wearing pearls. Other days brought blunt instruments, unsigned notes that called me a thief of tradition, a vandal of patriarchy painted as heritage. I kept them all. I did not keep them close. The drawer in Father's study learned the weight of other people's unfinished homework. One afternoon, while the orchard rehearsed stillness beneath a silver sky, the doorbell rang with the politeness that only people who never rang our bell before could manage. On the threshold stood Mrs. Landry, the neighbor whose lawn had always been an alibi for gossip. Her scarf was tied too tightly, as if she feared her own words might escape. "I've brought plum cake," she announced, nudging the cake forward like a peace flag stapled to a dessert. "And a question." We sat in the kitchen where stainless steel had finally begun to look like a place where food is cooked rather than a magazine interview. She cleared her throat. "Is it true," she asked, "that you're opening the solarium for story hours?" I nodded. "It is also true," I said, "that the stories will include ones we once refused to hear." Her eyes filled. "My mother worked in this house," she whispered. "I would like her name to be read somewhere, even if she cannot come to hear it." I wrote it down on the back of a utility bill because reverence can be practical. Her cake tasted like the past when it has decided to be kind. The house began to attract a new weather, voices that had never crossed the threshold because they had never been invited with sincerity. Alma from the flower shop came to teach the staff how to keep Amaryllis from fainting in overheated rooms. Jamal from the community center came to ask if the blue parlor could serve as a quiet testing room for teens who could not think clearly in crowded apartments. Luz's cousin brought Pozole to the kitchen, and the chef stood over the simmering pot with his hands on his hips like a man in church, learning a liturgy he wished he'd known sooner. The rooms adjusted. The chandelier in the hall, once a chandelier about chandeliers, began to be a chandelier about light. Mother called less and arrived more. She appeared at odd hours the way regret does, present without a schedule, insistent without a script. She would stand in the foyer and comment on the weather like a diplomat negotiating with the sky, then drift into the music room, where she would run one finger along the piano as if checking it for dust that actually belonged to memory. We did not mention Christmas. We did not mention court. She would ask if there was tea. I would pour it into the cup with the delicate hairline crack, because some objects tell the truth even when asked to hold heat. She looked down at the crack and then up at me. "I didn't know," she said finally. "Because you didn't ask," I answered not unkindly. "Because asking would have made me helpless," she said, more to the saucer than to me. "No," I said. "It would have made you honest." She did not cry. She set the cup down so carefully the saucer did not complain. We sat there breathing the same air that our family had wasted for decades on performance. Air is patient. It will host every version of us until we decide which one can afford to stay. Adrian kept to the city, circling a story around himself so hard it started to tear at the edges. Defectors from his narrative arrived at my gate like leaves arriving at a fence. They hadn't asked to move, but wind had opinions. One was his assistant, Nora, who handed me a thumb drive as if it were contraband, which in a way it was. Calendars, memos, wireframes of plans to launder reputation into opportunity. "He isn't evil," she said, surprising herself by how insufficient the sentence sounded in our foyer. "He just loves a mirror." I thanked her and gave her what our family had never been generous with, a good reference, honest and specific. She cried, which frightened the cat and decided the afternoon's mood. On the 12th Friday, the house hosted its first honest argument. It was between me and the mirror in Father's study. "You are becoming them," it said, harsh with the voice I had always loaned it. You are learning to enjoy the view from the head of the table. I stood there and let the accusation air itself out. Pride is a fire hazard when left unattended. It is also warmth when managed. Yes, I said to my reflection. And I will use the view to see what they refuse to look at. The mirror did not apologize. Mirrors rarely do. But it unclenched. The room exhaled. The cat returned to her perimeter check. I wrote a list of tasks that would keep me busy enough to earn the quiet that followed. Meet with the bursar at the community college. Speak with the pastor about the winter fuel fund. Call the city about those streetlights near the bus stop that had been out since September, making fear the last stop on the route. Winter tilted toward that brittle brightness that can crack a person if they try to bend in it. The house learned a new sound, laughter that didn't ask permission. It came from the solarium on Saturday mornings when toddlers wandered toward books and teenagers pretended to be bored until a sentence found them. It came from the kitchen on Thursdays when Luz's playlist taught the chef that time could dance. It came, surprisingly and then regularly, from Mother, who discovered that babies do not care who you were if you hand them a wooden block with respect. In the middle of this new music, the last bad storm of the season assembled itself with thoroughness. Weather maps on our phones spun colors into fear. Wind rehearsed by practicing on doors that needed better hinges. The groundskeeper salted before dawn the way an old soldier cleans a rifle. Repetition is competence's mother. By late afternoon, the town lost power in those patchwork pockets that make a community look like a quilt someone tried to mend in the dark. Our generator grumbled awake, the good kind of grumbling that means, I'll hold you. The house gathered light into itself like a promise it had been saving. And people came. They came up the drive, shoulders hunched against a snow that had no interest in their schedules. Elderly neighbors who couldn't keep their heat on. Parents who hadn't planned on the school closing early. A nurse whose shift turned into a double, and then the roads decided to argue. The foyer became a coat room not for fur but for damp thrift. The dining room remembered its duty and exceeded it. Bowls of soup lined up like soldiers fed for once before the battle. The piano did not insist on Chopin. It welcomed lullabies from 3 languages. Security held the door and could not stop smiling because shelter is a job that pays in something they trust. In the middle of this clean usefulness, conflict sent an emissary that did not know it was out of work. Adrian arrived not to take but to sit. He stood just inside the door and watched the dining room feed strangers with an efficiency that did not consult luxury. For a moment his face looked like a boy at the edge of a lake he had always been forbidden to swim in. You turned the house into a village, he said, not accusing, not praising, simply recording. No, I said. I turned it back into one. He said nothing for a while. He helped carry cots to the solarium because night was not yet finished with us. He took a bowl of soup and did not ask what was in it. He sat beside the nurse, who had found a chair that forgave her posture, and nodded like a man who had finally met another person's fatigue without turning it into a metaphor for his own. When the generator hiccuped and then decided to soldier on, the room applauded it, not out of relief but respect. Machines deserve manners. At 2 a.m, with sleeping people gathered in the house like commas gathered in a long sentence, I found Adrian in the hall of portraits. He stood before Father's face, which looked less like a patriarch at that hour and more like a man who needed to be forgiven for being born into a decade that gave him the wrong vocabulary for love. Adrian did not turn. He raised me to win, he said. He raised me to serve, I said. We stayed in that grammar until dawn rinsed the windows and the generator cleared its throat for the last time. He left with a nod. The storm left with less grace. But leaving is leaving. Mother arrived at noon the next day, not to survey, not to scold, but to help gather blankets. She moved through the room she had once curated for praise and seemed surprised that usefulness did not bruise her. In the kitchen, she stopped at the bulletin board where we had begun pinning notes, coat sizes, medication names, bus schedules, the doodle a child left of our chandelier as a spaceship. Her hand hovered over the pushpins. Your father, she said, was better at kindness in private. He thought public kindness was vanity. I rinsed a ladle. Private kindness is apology avoiding consequences, I said. Public kindness is accountability. She opened her mouth to argue and then didn't. I loved him, she said, small and clean. I know, I said. I loved him enough to stop doing it his way. The next letter from the court was not about us. It was about someone we paid who had not been paid enough by us for years because a spreadsheet had been obeyed the way scripture is not, without interpretation. The auditor's note was unforgiving in the correct way. I called a meeting in the library where the books could supervise and make sure we told the truth. We recalibrated wages and back pay. The chef said yes before the sentence finished because he knew what loyalty should cost. The groundskeeper nodded once, as if a machine had finally been oiled and would behave now without complaint. When the checks went out, the house felt lighter by an ounce in every room, which is how justice measures itself. The first rumor of spring arrived inside a box of seed packets with a note from a schoolteacher, who could not stop imagining better lunches for children who have never had a tomato that tasted like a decision made near them. The groundskeeper and I met her by the old carriage house and plotted raised beds where ornament had once been the only crop. "Will it be a garden for charity?" she asked. "No," I said. "For neighborhood." She grinned the grin of a person whose job buys chalk. "So charity," she said, and I let her be right because she was. In the midst of all this building, the old wound remembered it had not delivered its last lesson. A reporter with the kind of smile that turns microphones into weapons appeared at the gate with a request for the human side. Security returned with the request written on a card that did not ask to come inside. I walked out. The reporter squared her shoulders the way people do when they mistake proximity for victory. "Some say," she began, "that you used the courts to steal what tradition would have awarded to." I raised a hand. "Help me," I said. "Define tradition." She blinked in the cold. "Legacy," she said. "Inheritance. Bloodlines." I nodded. "And what is tradition without accountability?" She paused because her producer had not given her that word to juggle. "A costume," I answered. "A costume we can afford to take off now." She tried a smile that asked to survive editing. "Can I quote you?" "Please," I said. "But do not misquote the soup." After she left, I returned to the kitchen where bowls still produced steam like a promise. Luz laughed when I told her the line about soup. "That's right," she said. "Let them print the menu." She taught me how to fold a tortilla, so it could carry more than it should without splitting. "Like you," she added. Then returned to the pot because compliments are only useful if they let you return to work stronger. Evenings quieted into a new normal that did not depend on applause to feel alive. I learned the cadence of a day that belongs to more than one person. Mornings for decisions, afternoons for listening, twilight for walking the house with a mug in my hand and asking questions I had once saved for people who could not answer them. When it had one, it gave it. When it didn't, it offered a draft-free corner, which is sometimes better. On a Tuesday that smelled like thawed earth and laundry detergent, I found a small envelope tucked into the spine of Father's stewardship book. It was addressed in my mother's hand, the neat script she reserved for invitations and apologies. Inside were 4 photographs, each an admission. The first, Father and me on the front steps, my knees a riot of band-aids, his grin sloppy with love that did not yet fear being seen. The second, Mother at a card table counting coins for the church fuel drive, her face not yet hardened by the attention she mistook for approval. The third, Adrian asleep at the dining table over a school project, my blanket laid over his shoulder so quietly it did not wake him, the blanket I had pretended to have lost so he could keep it when winter crept under his door. The fourth, the deed transfer letter, unsealed, dated the week after Father's diagnosis, with a yellow note attached in Mother's hand. I fought him on this. I was wrong. Wind moved in the chimney like someone clearing their throat to speak kindly after a long habit of critique. I did not confront her with the envelope. I invited her to the orchard. We stood at the split trunk and let our coats make us look like taller women than we were. "I have been angry at you longer than my memory admits," I said. "I have been afraid of you longer than mine does," she said. We did not hug. We let the tree stand between us like a pastor who knows that touch is sometimes a shortcut that robs the soul of its necessary distance. "You taught me to be elegant," I said. "You taught me to be useful," she answered. "Let's exchange lessons." We promised nothing beyond showing up tomorrow. It was enough to make the path home look newly plowed. Then came the afternoon that pulled every thread tight enough to hum. A law firm I did not recognize sent a courier with a package stamped urgent. Inside, notice of a motion Adrian's counsel planned to file, an emergency appeal rooted not in law but in appetite. It claimed irreparable harm to his reputation should the deed remain as is, as if reputation were a child he had misplaced at the fair. The judge set a hearing for the following week, perhaps to teach the motion that urgency is a uniform often worn by people who do not pack their own lunches. I chose not to panic. Panic is a brag disguised as fear. Look how much I have to lose. Instead, I prepared. I invited the people whom the house served to write letters, not as weapons but as weather data. What did the house do? Now that its deed was in the name it had been intended to find, the letters arrived thick and unadorned. A child's crayon thank you for the Saturday story where the dragon learned sharing. Notes from staff about checks that arrived on time. Schedules that respected feet. A statement from the bursar detailing the small scholarship fund we had seeded with a quilt made of unused party budgets. Even the groundskeeper, a man who writes like he salts, only where it will keep someone from falling, sent 3 sentences about how a property tells the truth about its owner by how the hedges are trimmed. Not too much. The attorney sorted them into a folder that felt heavier, and therefore truer, than our opponent's adjectives. The night before the hearing, the house asked for a rehearsal of quiet. I walked from room to room with the lights low and thanked furniture for holding tired bodies, thanked windows for refusing to distort the sky into flattery, thanked stairs for teaching knees to confess their age. In the library, I lit 1 candle and read Father's sentence out loud because sentences like that are medicine that must be taken as directed. When I finished, the wick sighed. I did too. Courtrooms are winter in architecture form. They are built to keep the air at a temperature that discourages hubris. The judge listened the way a reservoir listens to rain, not impressed by individual drops, interested in accumulation. Adrian's counsel performed urgency. Our counsel presented accumulation. Filings already decided, duties already discharged, people already served. The judge, who had never been handsome enough to be lazy, asked 2 questions about law and none about reputation. He denied the motion as if he were throwing a snowball back at a friend who had mistaken flirting for permission. "See you in spring," he said to the calendar, and that was all. Outside, the air had that pre-thaw smell like a rumor of mercy. Adrian stood near the steps. His coat too thin for the season he had chosen. He opened his mouth, then closed it. That was growth. "I don't know how to be your brother in this," he said finally. "You could begin," I said, "by being a person in it." He nodded like a man who had been handed a tool he did not yet know how to hold. He would learn or not. The weather would proceed. Back home there was work that did not care about hearings. A child had left a mitten in the solarium. It needed finding. The chef had over-ordered onions. It required soup. The mailbox had accumulated requests translated by need into please. I moved through it, a steward whose revenge had become a calendar full of ordinary mercies. That was the victory, to turn a wound into chores. That evening Mother asked to see the study. We stood at the desk, and she touched the brass letter opener like a relic at a pilgrimage site. "I wanted it to be him," she said. "I wanted him to be strong enough to choose you without being told." "He did choose," I said. "In this sentence. He just didn't know how to tell you it was love, not a loss." She nodded until her hair forgot to be perfect. "And you?" she asked. "What do you call this?" I looked around the room that had remembered its job. "A correction," I said. "And a beginning." She reached for my hand. We held it with the tentativeness of people who have learned the cost of careless touch. The chandelier asked for no applause. It simply offered light. When spring finally cracked winter's shell, the orchard answered like a choir swallowing air. Buds arrived with 0 patience, a green that insulted grayscale. The garden near the carriage house lifted its first spinach leaves like hands in a congregation where joy is not performed, only discovered. Children came to plant their names into dirt. Elder hands guided, younger knees dirted, laughter supervised. The house watched from a respectful distance. The only witness it required was the bee that chose our porch rail for a rest. And yet, because a story that pretends neatness earns nothing, one evening brought what felt like a relapse dressed as a delivery. A box on the front steps, no return address. Inside, the original menu from a gala mother had loved, annotated with stars beside courses that had impressed donors who were never hungry anyway. Beneath it, a note in Adrian's hand. "If I sell this, can I buy back my story?" I carried the box to the study and set it beside the deed. Paper met paper. No, I said out loud to a man who wasn't there. But you can write a new one. I returned the menu to him with the deed sentence photocopied on the back. He would understand or he wouldn't. Mercy does not get to grade itself. Night fell, and the house made the sound of a place relieved to be useful. In the blue parlor, a student fell asleep over an exam and woke up stronger. In the kitchen, a recipe learned a new spice and pretended it had always known it. In the hall, the portraits kept watching, but in the reflection of their glass I could see the movement behind me, people going where they needed to go, not because they were forced, but because the doors were open and the floor was trustworthy. I stood at the window and let my breath fog the glass. With my finger I wrote the word we had never learned to use without choking, us. The fog thinned, the letters softened, but the word remained long enough to be read by anyone walking by who knew how to look up. Somewhere beyond the gate, rumor would invent me again. Let it. The house had picked its pronoun. It would keep it. And in that steadied quiet, the next turning point stepped out of shadow like a guest who had been waiting to arrive at the exact right moment. A discovery in the attic, the kind that opens doors you didn't know were painted on the wall. The groundskeeper found it first in a trunk mislabeled linens, a portfolio of letters between father and the man who sold him this house. Not a deed, a covenant. And in its clauses lay the map for what I must do next, a promise the house had been waiting decades to collect. The hinge had appeared. The door would move. The heartbeat of the house, restored and resolute, quickened, not in fear but in recognition. The attic did not creak so much as remember. Would accepts wait the way elders accept confession, without surprise and with a patience that makes fear look noisy. Afternoon angled through a small dormer and turned dust into constellations. We followed the beam the way sailors follow a stubborn star. The trunk wore a label that lied. Linens in my mother's old hand. The tidy script she used when naming things made them safer. The groundskeeper had set it near the dormer because he trusted light to tell truth. Found this under a moth-eaten rug, he said, the words as casual as a door left unlocked. He carried the trunk to me like a parcel that should have been delivered decades earlier. It was the kind of trunk that knew ships and separations. Leather scuffed into geography. Brass corners dented the way time dents courage. The buckles yielded with the sigh of old decisions. On top, folded blueprints, the house sketched like a cathedral daring whether to argue. Beneath, a folio tied with faded ribbon. The ribbon resisted, as if reluctance were respect. I loosened it the way you loosen an apology, carefully, accepting that it will never be neat again. Inside, the first page was not a deed. It was a letter. The paper had browned into a kind of wisdom. The ink moved with a hand that trusted nouns more than adjectives. To the next keeper of this house. A home with land is not a trophy. It is a working promise. The signature at the bottom carried a name we had pruned from family stories. Miriam Ashe, the widow who sold the estate to my grandfather just after the war, when steel money decided land made a better mirror. Mother had called her eccentric. The columnists had called her reclusive. The letter called her the architect of a condition. Behind the letter, a document. Not a transfer. A covenant. Notarized in a county whose courthouse still smells like calendars and rain. Terms cut with the clean blade of someone who loved verbs. The orchard to remain untimbered. The east meadow to host a harvest table open to neighbors twice each year. The carriage house to house a craft or a craftsperson. A portion of the house to be held, in spirit if not in title, for the vulnerable when winter teeths. And, here the text leaned forward, the keeper to maintain a common room for reading and assembly, doors unlocked on Saturdays unless plague or flood forbade it. Failure, over any rolling period of 7 years, and a trigger would activate. Title would offer itself first to a land trust Miriam had endowed, then to the county for a library, with fair compensation but no discussion. A covenant is a bridge you do not get to decorate. You cross it and you keep it from collapsing, or you lay down your feet and make room for someone else who will. I read the clauses twice, then a third time, as if repetition might soften the imperative. It didn't. By the time the sun moved its square of light 3 inches across the attic floor, the turning point had installed itself in the house like a new heartbeat. Father had known. Of course he had. The last page of the folio held his signature acknowledging receipt when he purchased from the estate, and beneath it, smaller, a note in his familiar hand. The honorable burden. Eleanor will understand. The date was the same week as the letter he wrote that deeded the house to me after he died. 2 sentences, separated by years, had conspired to meet me on this wooden floor. Downstairs, the house was already half common in practice, the solarium full on Saturdays, the kitchen serving soup to people whose hunger did not announce itself, the blue parlor a study instead of a shrine. But covenant asks for more than intention. It asks for form. I brought the folio to the study the way one brings a new delivery room to a home that must now learn to be quiet differently. The brass lamp pooled its respectful glow. I called the attorney. His voice did the small whistle it does when law meets something older than law. It's valid, he said. More than valid. It's prelude. We mapped the 7-year metric against the family's tenure. We found plenty of violation, parties instead of harvest tables, car auctions instead of craft, speeches instead of common room. And then a reprieve. Covenants measure intention too, and intention changes what the clock thinks it knows. If we codify what you've been doing, he said, we can align the house with the covenant in the eyes of anyone who might try to test it. Form the foundation. Record the use. Announce the promise. Announce. The word pricked my pride. I had taught myself to distrust announcements. Too often they were simply excuses with better lighting. But this wasn't a party. It was a sentence we had owed the county for 70 years. We built a plan with the stubborn humility good work requires. The Montgomery Common Room Foundation would hold a purpose easement on the main floor, legal language that carved function into oak. The orchard's protection would be recorded not as a wish but as a boundary. The carriage house would house a craft with hands and hours again, not a memory of horsepower. The East Meadow would lay a harvest table twice yearly or forfeit our right to call ourselves neighbors. And the common room would be what Miriam had required, a door that made Saturday larger than itself. But turning points are expensive not in money but in muscle. This one demanded I carry more than resentment. It asked me to carry a promise across the river of my family's habits. I could feel the water tug at my calves. I began with Mother, not because she was a gatekeeper but because she was a weather vane. She knew the direction pain would blow before clouds formed. I found her in the music room, pretending the piano was a table, arranging these with a concentration that almost fooled both of us. There was a woman before us, I said. Miriam Ashe. Mother's hands paused mid-stem. She had too many conditions, she murmured, as if the lilies might agree. I placed the folio on the lid and opened it to the page where the covenant spoke without permission. She read standing because chairs are for people who will not be asked to change. When she finished, her face did not register defeat. It registered relief. I hated our parties, she said quietly, shocking herself with the clarity. They were just purchasing reputation with lights. She touched the clause about the common room with the back of a finger, as if the words were a feverish brow. We never unlocked any door without a guest list. We stood there practicing a new family sport, telling the truth without letting shame rent a room. Will you help me? I asked. The old me would never have asked her to carry anything. I had not trusted her with delicate parcels. She lifted her chin, a motion I had learned to read as condescension. This time it was commitment. Tell me where to stand, she said, and what to hold. I handed her the list of neighbors who should get the first invitation to a Saturday with no RSVP. Her mouth made a small O of surprise. You're going to invite them? I'm going to fulfill a sentence, I said. Inviting is the verb. Adrian heard the covenant the way thunder travels, by rumor through rafters, even before I chose to involve him. I did not call. He called me a novelty in both directions. His voice had lost that slickness ambition varnishes over boys who never had to mop anything. So, he said, dragging out the single syllable like a chair across tile, you're turning the house into a charity? Into obedience, I answered. A long silence. You think that saves you? He asked, and there it was, the flicker of the old Street Fighter posture. It saves the house, I said. You and I will have to save ourselves. Sigh. A flicker of honesty trying to find how the mouth works. What do you need? He said, surprising us both. A blacksmith, I said. He laughed, short and involuntary. You can have 3. We found one. Not because Adrian had a list of artisans on speed dial. Money remembers jewelers, not smiths. but because Jamal from the community center had an uncle who still heated iron in a coal forge under the railroad viaduct, making hinges for old barns that refused to retire. We went to see him on a Tuesday that smelled like melted snow. The forge glowed the color of afternoons you never forget. His hands were what the word vocation is for. "What do you want the carriage house to hold?" he asked without small talk. "A craft," I said. "A craft that confesses." He nodded. "Metal tells the truth when you hit it right." We hired him without haggling because some prices are a prayer, and you do not dicker with prayer. The attorney filed the easements with a speed that suggested he loved this part of his job and simply did not have occasions to prove it. The bank carved out the account for the foundation, and for once the word restricted felt like safety, not control. The county clerk, weary and kind, stamped the papers with a satisfying thud that made the desk shiver. Bureaucracy, when pointed at goodness, becomes sacrament. We set a date for the first Saturday, a word as ordinary as soap, and that was the point. Flyers went up where flyers live. Laundromats, library corkboards, the community center's battered announcement case. The deli where gossip is currency and kindness is the one thing more portable than cash. Reading tea, heat, chairs that don't apologize, the flyer promised. No IDs. No explanations. Bring a story if you have one. Borrow one if you don't. The day arrived without theatrics. Weather minded its manners. The house cleaned itself of no purpose and put on the scent of bread warming. We opened the front door, then the library doors, then something metaphysical between them. People came as if their feet had been practicing the route while their minds debated. A woman I recognized from the bus stop with the broken streetlight arrived with two boys who kept their hands in their pockets until the fireplace talked them into confidence. A retired teacher claimed a chair and offered, without fuss, to host a circle for people whose tongues grow tired in English. A man with a paint-spattered jacket asked if he could fix the blue parlor's window latch in exchange for coffee. We said yes, then asked him to teach 3 teenagers the latch's secret while he worked. Mother stood at the threshold to the library with a basket of blank cards as if she had been born to it. "Write the name of someone you wish were here," she told each person. "We will read the names softly after tea." She did not know until then that her voice could hold names without breaking them. When she read, her old elegance returned transformed, no longer armor but lace that allows light through. In the carriage house, the blacksmith set up a small mobile forge that hissed with the authority of a useful machine. Children watched, ignorant of irony, as he turned straight metal into a bracket with a curl like a treble clef. "A hinge," he explained, letting them feel the cooled weight. "So doors can do their job." He glanced toward the big house and smiled. "Seems timely." He agreed to move in on Mondays and Wednesdays to teach apprentices. Adrian showed up with a truckload of sawhorses and an apology he pretended was for the late delivery. We let him pretend. Contrition sometimes needs to wear overalls before it can be believed. The East Meadows ground still slept, so we laid a token table. A plank over sawhorses, plates borrowed, no centerpieces because the center had moved into people's throats. We served stew and bread and the dignity of seconds. I watched a man I did not know cut his slice of bread in half and give the warm half to a woman I did not know. And I understood what Miriam had known. Covenants restore what titles erode. A deed can be a mirror. Covenant is a window. By mid-afternoon, the common room had learned its acoustics. A girl with a violin tried a slow scale and heard forgiveness in the way the wood answered. An old man told a story about the blizzard of '78 that was mostly about the woman he lost that year, and which he had never been allowed to tell without being told to move on. He did not move on. He moved in. A teenager read a poem he pretended not to have written. When he finished, he shrugged the way boys shrug when they plan to survive. The house did not clap. It held the silence after, the rare kind you can live in. At sunset, after the last cups had found the sink and the last chair had decided where it belonged, I went to the study and laid the covenant beside the deed. Paper met paper with the soft consonant of missions aligning. Father's sentence and Miriam's clause looked at each other like relatives reunited at a train station after years of letter writing. I felt something unfasten inside my ribs that had been cinched since childhood. The house did not just belong to me. I belonged to it and to the sentence it kept. Turning points rarely bless you without billing you. The bill came that evening in the form of an email from Adrian's counsel. Subject line, Asset Recovery Request. The body requested the return of certain items of historic familial significance from the house: vases, paintings, the set of silver he believed had been earmarked for him, and the grandfather clock whose chime had measured our growing. They listed each item as if naming a thing could replace understanding it. Attached, a threat dressed as courtesy, a draft complaint alleging conversion. The word looked like a joke wearing someone else's suit. We were converting, yes, but not what he thought. The attorney drafted a response so clean it felt like a breeze. Title remained in the house. The house was now governed by a recorded purpose. Items named were part of that purpose. Any claim would embarrass itself in daylight. He concluded with an offer. If Adrian needed cash, the foundation would purchase from him, at fair market value, the modern sculpture he had hung on loan in the blue parlor, a wave of steel that had always looked to me like a man trying to remember how to bow. The purchase would clear one of his pressing debts. It would also teach two good lessons at once: that we would pay for what we used, and that he could be saved without being coddled. The email went out. The house hummed its agreement. A week later, he came with the sculpture and a receipt. He did not linger over the exchange. Embarrassment hates air. But before he left, he stood again in the hall of portraits and looked at our father, and then at the framed sentence hung beside him. "You think this absolves him?" he asked, not hostile, not rhetorical. "No," I said. "It absolves the house." He nodded, a motion so small it could have been a heartbeat. "Maybe that's where absolution should start," he said, and then softer, "I'm going to the forge tomorrow. Jamal's uncle said I could burn my sleeves." He lifted his arm, fingers brushing cuffs that had never known honest grime. "We'll get you a different shirt," I said. The joke landed like a handshake. Spring rehearsed itself on the orchard's tongue. We planned the first proper harvest table the way one plans a wedding that refuses to use the word. Lists loved us for the right reasons now. Chairs, canopies, permission for the road to slow to one lane and for the neighbor's violin to be late and still be perfect. The blacksmith mounted new hinges on the carriage house doors. When he swung them open, they did not squeal. They sighed, a relief that sounded like music that has finally learned the key. On a Tuesday that smelled like damp soil and bureaucracy, the county commissioner visited with the librarian in tow. They walked the rooms with that blend of skepticism and hope civil servants carry like a tit. The librarian paused in the common room and measured the walls with her eyes. "We've been trying to start a branch program on this side of town," she said, "but real estate pretends it doesn't know us." I handed her the covenant. She read the clause about the common room and the Saturdays, and then the one about the county's right should the keeper fail. "You won't," she said. "But if you do, we know what to do next." She smiled with a practical grace that made me want to take notes. "I'll send books," she added. "Not the kind people think you want. The kind they actually need." The common room preened, which is to say the dust looked pretty in the light. Mother found her vocation in something none of us expected: the name's basket. She learned to pronounce what she had previously learned to avoid. She called people by how they carried their syllables, not how paper insisted. The basket became a sacrament. People began to leave more than names. Worries folded small, victories folded smaller because they feared bragging, recipes, phone numbers, a ribbon from a child's hair. One afternoon, she read a card and covered her mouth. It was from a woman who had known her 30 years ago when the house made fear. "I cleaned your dining room and pretended it was mine for 5 minutes when no one was looking. Thank you for letting me be seen in it." My mother sat down without asking anyone whether she looked dignified. "I didn't know," she whispered again, this time to a stranger who had just become a neighbor. The turning came not with a gavel but with a hammer. In the carriage house, Adrian swung and missed and then swung and hit. The blacksmith corrected his wrist the way a father corrects a son when he is done trying to be impressive. Sparks skipped like punctuation. Adrian laughed, not the performative bark he had trained for cameras, but the laugh a boy makes when something heavy finally tells him the truth and doesn't break him. Afterward he came into the kitchen, forearms reddened, and asked for ice not for show but because pain is information. Luz handed him a bag. "Eat," she said. "You didn't know how hungry you were." He obeyed her without irony. The house watched and decided to allow itself a small private smile. That night, with the covenant tucked back into its folio in the safe that had learned to hold more than currency, I pulled out another envelope from Father, one I had not yet found a place to open. On the front, His writing, a slant that had steadied corporations and children. If you ever need thunder. I laughed, exhausted and alert. I opened it. Inside, a single typed page, the ribbon faint in places like a memory. He had drafted a speech he never gave. It was for a harvest table that never happened. He had planned to stand at the head of the East Meadow and say, "Welcome. We forgot you. We remembered. Please eat." Then a handwritten line, "Thunder is just sound that takes the long road. Kindness is lightning." I set the page beside the covenant. I did not cry. I did not need to. The house cried for me, the pipes knocking somewhere in the wall as if an old apology had finally reached the right floor. We scheduled the harvest table for the first Saturday of true summer. The orchard conspired, blossoms begetting fruit with no regard for our capacity to be worthy. People brought pies and folding chairs like declarations of independence. A quartet tuned under the ash tree. A boy carried a dog. A girl carried a poem. A grandmother carried a story that fit in her apron pocket and in the mouths of everyone who would ever live here. We laid boards on sawhorses, the blacksmith's hinges gleaming on the carriage house doors as if they had known precisely this light was coming. Before we ate, I stood where Father had planned to and did not make a speech. I made a sentence. "Welcome," I said. "We forgot you. We remembered. Please eat." Wind did what wine does with sentences that deserve to linger. It carried them against cheeks and into hair and along the table until even the surest were invited. Muddy mouth learning a new kind of power. Adrian poured water. And nobody clapped because he was doing what any person with hands should do. The librarian stacked books on a cart and laughed when a line formed. Luz opened foil and invented a generosity of portion that made money blush. Somewhere toward the end of the meal, when the light had turned honey-thick and the shadows had learned to behave, the county commissioner stood and cleared his throat. "We don't issue proclamations for private tables," he said. "But this isn't private anymore, is it?" He held up a piece of paper. "People brace for pageantry." He smiled. "Nothing grand, I promise. Just a notice that the county recognizes the Montgomery Common Room as a public reading room on Saturdays." The room was not a room. It was a meadow and a house and a basket of names and the clink of a ladle against a pot. It bowed to bureaucracy and made it look beautiful. The turning point had turned. The house, once a scene of humiliation where a brother raised a glass to exile his sister, had become a table long enough to seat the exiled and the exiling, the elegant and the employed, the ones who used to clean around the baseboards pretending nobody noticed them and the ones who signed checks pretending that counted as noticing. Revenge had finished its work the way a surgeon finishes a surgery, by stitching the wound closed and leaving a scar honest enough to teach whether, after the table was cleared and the last pie tin washed without anyone counting who brought what, I walked the perimeter in the blue that belongs to houses that have finally remembered their job. The blacksmith's hammer had gone quiet. The forge breathed out. In the common room, two teenagers argued which book should go home with which of them. They solved it with a coin that had more common sense than some boards I've known. In the kitchen, Luz wrote a list on the board and under onions she wrote forgiveness, and then crossed it out and replaced it with cilantro because we had enough forgiveness for today, and the salsa needed help. I went to the study and slipped Father's thunder into the folio beside Miriam's claws. The safe received them like a liturgy. I pressed my palm to the wall where warmth gathers over concealed steel, and felt a pulse that did not belong to the house and did not belong to me and therefore belonged to both. What happens when promise and person finally share a bloodstream? I knew then what the next acts would ask. Not to outdo this day with spectacle, but to repeat it with steadiness until repetition becomes character. Covenants like love are proved by chores. The turning point had not only turned me, it had turned the calendar. Revenge had matured into governance. Heartbreak had found employment. When I stepped onto the porch, the orchard held its breath the way an audience does when the music is over and they are deciding whether to rise. No ovation. Just the sound of 100 small goodbyes that were actually returns, promises to come back, to bring a friend, to carry a story in the pocket next to the bus pass, to borrow a book and then come back for another. The moon took attendance and approved. Behind me, the grandfather clock prepared to count the hour. It would strike not as a metronome of hierarchy, but as the pulse of a house that had survived humiliation, adjudicated conflict, and discovered that the deed was never the point. The sentence was. The covenant was. The table was. The chime rang once, twice, a dozen times, and did not apologize for its history. The sound traveled the hall, brushed the portraits, curled around the basket of names, tugged at the blacksmith's anvil, kissed the librarian's cart, and found Mother in the doorway, fingers ink-smudged from handling more than lilies. She smiled without posing. Adrian stood in the yard, forearms nicked, holding the last chair. The house heard itself and for the first time in my life relaxed. The turning was complete. The hinge had not broken. The door would stay open. Morning arrived dressed in gold, like it had been waiting for the house to deserve light again. Sunlight slid across the floors, lingered on the carved banister, and caught in the glass of the portraits that had long refused to see. The house had become more than walls. It was memory learning manners. And I, its reluctant steward turned quiet architect, had become something I didn't yet have a name for. Perhaps peace. Perhaps purpose disguised as fatigue. The orchard hummed in green, and the forge breathed smoke from the carriage house. The meadow was scattered with plates from the feast, still drying in the sun, like the aftermath of forgiveness. The scent of bread refused to leave the kitchen, as if wanting to remind the house what nourishment smelled like. Everything held a softness that only follows storms that tell the truth. For weeks after the harvest table, the air in the house felt changed. Every corridor, every doorknob seemed to hum with a new rhythm, as though the architecture itself had exhaled after holding its breath for decades. The staff walked differently, lighter, unhurried but purposeful. Laughter had returned not as rebellion but as belonging. And I, once the ghost in my own lineage, found myself waking early not from dread, but from quiet curiosity about what the day might ask of me. Letters began to arrive again, but this time they didn't wound. Some were handwritten, trembling with sincerity. Notes from women I had never met, who had sat through Christmas dinners where someone else's power masqueraded as family. I saw the video of the table, one began, and I cried, because I thought houses like yours could never love people like us. Another wrote simply, "You taught me to stay until I can afford to leave, and then to build something no one can take." But not all letters were kind. Some came from voices that didn't like the idea of old stories being rewritten. "Tradition is fragile," one said, "and women like you are dangerous with scissors." I pinned that one above the kitchen desk as a reminder. Sometimes, danger is just another word for necessary. Mother spent her mornings now among shelves of the common room. She had become the unofficial librarian, cataloging more than just titles. I watched her hands move carefully over each spine, as if she were forgiving them for being unread for so long. People brought her gifts, bookmarks made from ribbon, jars of jam, paper cranes folded by children who had learned to find the library by heart. I would walk in to find her mid-conversation with a stranger. "Stories," she'd say, tapping the open page, "are just homes we can all rent for a while." She said it like she'd waited a lifetime to believe it. One day, as she shelved a row of biographies, she asked, "Do you ever miss it, the old life?" I paused. The question felt like a knock from the past. "I miss the simplicity of not knowing better," I said. "Ignorance is a kind of comfort. But I wouldn't trade what we've built for all the chandeliers in the world." She nodded. "I miss the certainty," she admitted. "It was easier when I thought our silence made us noble. Silence, I've learned, isn't noble. It's just a room where guilt decorates itself." In the forge, Adrian worked without the theater that once followed him everywhere. His hands had learned to respect labor. There was something beautiful in watching arrogance learn humility through the discipline of sweat. Sparks danced around him like punctuation, small brilliant truths declaring themselves at the end of sentences he had never finished as a boy. The blacksmith, whose patience could tame steel, spoke to him like a father might to a son who'd finally stopped trying to impress. "You swing too hard," he'd say. "Strength is knowing where to stop." Adrian nodded, and for once didn't argue. Later, over coffee in the kitchen, he told me something I didn't expect. "I keep dreaming of the night I told you to leave," he said, his voice quiet. "Except every time I wake up, it's me standing outside in the snow, watching the lights from the window and you're inside." I studied his face. The believed cruelty was power. "Maybe that's your conscience trying to come in from the cold," I said. He gave a half-smile. "You always were the poet of us." "And you," I said, "were the warning." We didn't laugh. We didn't need to. It was the kind of silence that finally earned its keep. The days melted into a rhythm that felt holy in its ordinariness. Each morning began with tasks that made meaning out of motion: oiling hinges, polishing brass, tending the garden, greeting the library guests, counting blankets for the shelter. Every evening ended with a moment of reflection, me in the study, the lamp haloing Father's folio, the deed resting quietly in the wall behind the wainscoting like a guardian angel that refused to show its wings. Sometimes I would trace my finger over the brass keyhole of the safe, whispering, "We did it." And other times I would sit by the window, letting my mind wander back to the girl who once cried in this same house for not being seen. I would tell her softly, "We're home now." But peace, real peace, always costs maintenance. And legacy loves to test its guardians. It began again in whispers because destruction always starts politely. An article appeared in a glossy magazine, the kind that still worships pedigree like it's proof of God. The decline of the Montgomery estate, it read, how a family dynasty lost its identity to the winds of modernity. There were pictures. The harvest table, the open doors, the common room filled with neighbors. They called it chaos. They called it a charity experiment masquerading as progress. They even called me the usurper in pearls. For a moment I felt that old familiar burn in my chest, the ache of being misrepresented, the humiliation of being seen through someone else's lens. But the difference now was this: I had a mirror that told the truth. The house itself. I went to the hall, where sunlight fell across the portraits of our ancestors. For years those faces had been my judges, now they were witnesses. I stood before Father's portrait, the man who'd once written a single sentence that saved us from ourselves. "You see, don't you?" I whispered. "We didn't destroy it. We fulfilled it." The glass caught my reflection beside his, and for the first time I didn't flinch. 2 generations sharing one truth, that power without purpose is just an inheritance of emptiness. Mother saw the article too. She didn't cry or rage. She folded the magazine in half, used it to prop up a wobbly table in the reading room and said, "Let them write what they want. Tables shouldn't tilt for gossip." Adrian saw it later and shrugged. "They needed a villain," he said. "I used to enjoy being one. Now it feels exhausting." And then, as if summoned by fate's sense of irony, an invitation arrived, from the same magazine. They were hosting a gala, celebrating women of legacy. My name was on the list. Mother looked at it first, eyebrows raised. "You won," she said simply. "No," I said. "They just realize they can't ignore the story anymore." "Will you go?" she asked. "Yes," I said. But not to accept. To witness. The night of the gala felt like stepping into a museum of the life I had outgrown. Crystal chandeliers, laughter with teeth, champagne that tasted like performance. Faces I hadn't seen since Father's funeral greeted me with the cautious curiosity of people encountering a rumor made flesh. "You look radiant," one woman said, her tone caught somewhere between envy and accusation. "Light does that when it belongs to you," I replied. She blinked, then smiled tightly. "Still poetic, I see." "Still standing," I said. When the speeches began, I listened. They spoke of legacy, of power passed down like heirloom silver, of women who preserved the dignity of old families. It was all embroidery, no fabric. When they called my name, I reacted. I took the stage, looked out over the sea of sequins and practiced smiles, and said, "Legacy isn't what we inherit. It's what we repair." I was taught to guard a name. Instead, I chose to make it mean something. If that looks like loss to you, then you've mistaken stillness for grace. No applause followed. Only the kind of silence that hangs between glass ceilings and the hands that will break them. When I returned home, the house was waiting the way it always did. I wiped the glass, expecting to see myself. But what I saw was everything this house had been. The dinners, the arguments, the emptiness, the storm, the laughter, the light. It was not a reflection, it was a timeline. When I finally saw my own face, it was surrounded by them all. The woman I was, the girl I'd been, the daughter who waited, the sister who forgave, the keeper who built. And behind me, faint but certain, Father's silhouette. He smiled, not proud but peaceful. "You did what I couldn't," his voice seemed to say. "You turned power into purpose." Tears came, but they weren't grief. They were recognition. That night, I moved the mirror to the foyer, where everyone would see themselves upon entering. I left it unpolished, a little cloudy, because truth should never be spotless. On the frame, I hung a small plaque that read, This house remembers everyone who helped it breathe again. Look closely. Some reflections arrive late, but they arrive. When the morning light struck it the next day, the glass flared bright, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw the house itself smiling. By summer's end, the covenant was not just law, it was life. The forge became a studio, the common room hosted debates and poetry nights, the meadows table doubled in length, and the orchard, once a symbol of privilege, fed the food pantry in town. The town that once looked up at us now walked up the hill as equals. The divide had closed not through speeches but through soup ladles and book spines and open gates. That's the kind of victory that never makes headlines but lasts forever. And me? I stopped measuring myself against ghosts. I began measuring by heartbeat, the laughter of a stranger in the library, the rhythm of a hammer in the forge, the steady hush of wind through branches that once bore fruit only for the chosen. It was enough. More than enough. Late one evening, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet but awake, I sat at the desk in the study and wrote one final letter to Father. You taught me to build. Mother taught me to endure. Adrian taught me the price of silence. But this house taught me grace. The kind that repairs instead of rules. You said I would understand someday. I do now. Love, Eleanor. I folded it and placed it beside the covenant. Paper to paper. Past to present. Silence to sound. The lamp flickered once, as though acknowledging the closing of a chapter. And outside, through the window, the orchard whispered in the dark. Not a warning. Not a memory. Promise. The mirror in the foyer caught a sliver of moonlight and threw it down the hall like a blessing, landing squarely on the words carved into the plaque. Look closely. And in that moment I realized, the house was no longer a story about revenge. It was a story about return. About a woman who lost everything, only to learn she'd never been homeless. Just waiting for the walls to remember her name. Dawn no longer crept into the house. It arrived openly, like a friend who didn't need to knock anymore. The winter that had nearly broken us was long behind, yet its echo remained, folded into the house like a pressed flower in a favorite book, fragile, but proof that beauty can survive cold. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and lilacs climbing the south wall. The orchard had grown wild and generous. Even the trees that once refused to fruit were heavy with promise, and for the first time in my life I didn't wake up thinking of what had been taken. I woke thinking of what had been restored. The rhythm of the house was good. Children came through the gate before school to feed the chickens that Adrian insisted on keeping for humility's sake. The forge clanged awake every morning, its heartbeat steady as breath. The library smelled of paper and cinnamon scones from Luz's oven. And the sound of Mother's voice drifted from room to room, not as command but as warmth. She read to children on Tuesdays now, her voice carrying through the sunlit corridors. Once, those same corridors had carried whispers of who was more important. Now they carried laughter and the thump of little shoes. Every sound that used to bruise the air, arguments, accusations, the clicking of polished heels, had been replaced by small sounds that meant something. Brooms sweeping, pages turning, hammers striking, tea being poured. The architecture of peace, built in the language of every day. I spent my mornings walking the perimeter of the orchard with the groundskeeper, Mr. Harris. He'd been here since before I was born. A man of few words but endless wisdom. He'd once told me, the ground remembers everything you bury in it. I used to think he meant guilt. Now I understood he meant growth. See that row? He said one morning, pointing to the oldest section of the orchard. Those were the first your father planted when he thought wealth was the same as permanence. Roots too close together. Choked each other out. He smiled. You gave them space. That's all they needed. I nodded, watching the sunlight slide across the leaves like a benediction. Maybe that's all people need, too. He grinned. You learned it the hard way. That's how it sticks. The wind caught the blossoms, and they swirled around us like forgiveness disguised as petals. In the afternoons, I taught classes in the common room, small sessions on stewardship and memory. Not lectures, not lessons. Conversations. Farmers, teachers, even teenagers from town sat in circles, sharing what it meant to hold something in it. We talked about legacy as a verb, not a noun. About forgiveness as a practice, not an event. About how revenge only feels like justice when you're cold. But when you heal, you learn that revenge is just love that's run out of breath. One afternoon, a teenage girl named Mabel raised her hand and asked, Do you ever wish he didn't tell you to pack your bags that night? The room fell still. I looked at her, her honesty raw and unpolished. No, I said softly, because I needed to leave to know what I was carrying. Some doors have to slam shut before you can build your own. She nodded like she understood something she wouldn't have words for until she was older. That's brave, she whispered. No, I said. That's mercy. On both of us. Mother had taken to writing letters again, longhand, the way women once wrote to be remembered. Every few days she'd hand me one, sealed in cream paper, to mail. I never asked to whom. But one morning, as she stood by the window watching Adrian hammer at the forge, she said, "You know, he writes to your father now." I blinked. Adrian. She smiled faintly. He says it helps him tell the truth. Dead men are the only audience he doesn't have to impress. Later, I found one of those letters by accident, half tucked into the drawer of the old desk. I shouldn't have read it, but I did. Dear Father, you were wrong about what strength looks like. It's not the man who keeps the world under his thumb. It's the man who learns to use his hands without breaking what they touch. I used to think winning made me whole. Now I know it only made me loud. She, Eleanor, built something that didn't need my permission. And for the first time, I'm proud of someone who isn't me. You would have hated that. But I think you would have understood it, too. I read it twice before folding it back carefully, the way you fold a prayer that's already been answered. Time, that old sculptor, began to soften us all. Adrian stayed at the forge most days. His blacksmith, who once called him the prince, now called him kid. Mother's hair silvered completely, and it suited her, the elegance of surrender. Luz's laughter had become the heartbeat of the kitchen, and the common room had expanded into an annex where students came to study after dark, their laptops glowing like small, faithful lanterns. And me, I began writing again. Not letters, not reports. Just pages. Pages about the house, about redemption, about what it means to inherit something broken and choose to fix it instead of flee it. I wrote at night when the world went quiet, when even the clock dared not interrupt. Some nights, I could almost hear Father's pen moving beside mine. Two ghosts writing from opposite sides of forgiveness. But redemption, brother, true redemption has a habit of circling back, asking you to face the last person you owe truth to, yourself. It began on a day that should have been ordinary. The first summer storm rolled in sudden and hard, rain thrashing the orchard in silver sheets. I was in the study when I heard it, the faint hum of the generator, the wind's low moan through the eaves, and beneath it, the ticking of the grandfather clock. That clock had measured everything: betrayal, exile, return. And for some reason I found myself walking to it. It had been silent for weeks, the mechanism tired. But now it was ticking again. I knelt, opened its glass face, and there, behind the pendulum, I saw something lodged in the shadowed groove of the frame. A folded paper, brittle with age. Pulled it free. It was addressed in Father's hand. To whoever finally listens. My breath caught. I unfolded it with the same care I'd give to holding someone's pulse. If you are reading this, it means the house has found its keeper again. I built it to last, but I never built it to love. Love is not structure. It's stewardship. And I failed to teach you that before it was too late. Forgive me for making strength look like silence. Forgive for making you think obedience was peace. The truth is, this house will outlive all of us, but only if it learns the one thing I never mastered: humility. If you can give it that, you've already restored me. The ink was faded, but the final line was clear, written with a trembling hand. Keep it open, Eleanor. I folded it back, pressed it against my chest, and for the first time in my life cried without resistance. Not the cry of grief, but of release, the sound a heart makes when it finally puts down the weight it mistook for duty. That night, when the storm passed, I found Adrian in the forge, the orange light licking at his face, rain still dripping from his hair. I found another letter, I said. He nodded. He wrote to you too? Yes. But it wasn't to me. It was to whoever would listen. He smiled sadly. Guess that makes you the listener, and you the echo, I said. He looked down at his hands, blackened with soot. I can live with that. The hammer came down once more. A single perfect strike, and a shower of sparks leapt like starlight between us. For a moment it didn't feel like metal, it felt like forgiveness taking form. By the end of that summer, the Montgomery Common Room Foundation had grown beyond our expectations. The county awarded it a civic grant. Local students began internships restoring archives in the attic. Journalists stopped asking about scandal and started asking about service. But none of that felt like triumph. It felt like something gentler, continuation. The kind of success that doesn't demand to be witnessed. And then came the night that sealed the circle completely. It was late September. The air had that ache of autumn, the scent of apples and endings. We held a second harvest table, longer this time. Nearly 100 chairs stretching across the meadow. Lanterns hung from branches, their light trembling like joy. People came from miles away, carrying casseroles and guitars and stories. At the head of the table, where Father won his stead, I saw Adrian this time, laughing, sleeves rolled, pouring cider. Mother beside him, reading a poem one of the children had written about the big house that grew a heart. I stood a little apart, watching. I didn't need the head of the table anymore. I had found my place, in the quiet edges where builders stand when they're done building. A little girl ran up to me, her face smudged with pie. "Miss Eleanor?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart." She pointed to the horizon, where the sunset burned like a final benediction. "Is the house magic?" I smiled. "Why do you ask?" "Because it used to be sad," she said, "and now it's kind." I knelt beside her, brushing a leaf from her hair. "It's not magic," I said. "It's memory learning to forgive." She nodded solemnly, as if that was an answer she could take home. When the guests were gone and only candlelight remained, I walked through the meadow, the lantern swaying in the wind. The orchard whispered its old lullabies, the same ones I used to imagine as a child. The house stood at the top of the hill, proud but softened, its windows glowing gold like eyes that no longer hid. And for the first time I saw it not as an inheritance but as an ancestor. Alive, breathing, redeemed. Inside, I paused at the mirror in the foyer. My reflection met me halfway. No longer haunted. The plaque beneath it caught the lamplight. Look closely, some reflections arrive late, but they arrive. Behind me, Mother hummed in the library, Adrian laughed from the kitchen, and Luz closed the door softly on the last guest. Home. Not the kind you inherit. The kind you earn. I returned to the study one last time that night, sat at Father's desk and opened my journal. Outside, thunder rumbled again, but softer this time, like applause from a gentle heaven. And I wrote, "We built our revenge into something sacred. We turned betrayal into blueprint. And in the end, the house didn't save us. We saved it. Because every brick of this place carries the sound of forgiveness when struck gently enough." The ink bled slightly on the paper and I smiled. Imperfection, I've learned, is proof of honesty. Then, as midnight gathered on the windows, I whispered to the silence that had once terrified me, "Thank you for not staying empty." The house didn't reply. Didn't need to. Its warmth answered for it, in the only language it knew: light. Autumn came like forgiveness. Quiet, certain, and long overdue. The leaves turned in slow applause, golden palms waving at the house that had finally learned to listen. Mornings were cool enough to demand sweaters, evenings warm enough to keep the windows cracked open so laughter could slip out and travel across the orchard. And beneath it all, beneath the creak of stairs and hum of radiators, there was a pulse. A rhythm that didn't belong to clocks or deeds or dynasties. It belonged to something older. A truth rediscovered. A home reborn. Every story I've learned has two kinds of endings. The one we write, and the one life delivers after we've put down the pen. By the time that second harvest passed, the house had grown into something even Miriam Ashe couldn't have predicted. What began as a family estate had become a living compass, pointing toward what good can do when pride is exiled. The Montgomery Foundation had taken root beyond our gates. Scholarships, apprenticeships, and grants for local farmers began. The forge produced hinges and heart alike, literal and metaphorical craftsmanship. A small wing of the county library now bore our name, though I asked them to make it small. Names, I told them, should whisper when they've already shouted enough. But the biggest change wasn't visible in any report or ledger. It was in the air itself. Where power had once clung to these walls like dust, now gratitude hung there instead, invisible but unmistakable. I remember one morning in particular. The kind of morning that makes you pause halfway through your first cup of coffee, because you feel the world balancing itself. I stood on the porch looking down the hill at the children walking to school, some of them the same who'd once come to our story hours. They waved as they passed the orchard, as if greeting an old friend. And then between the rows of trees I saw something new, or maybe something ancient that had waited for this day. A young woman barefoot, collecting apples in her apron. Her hair loose, her smile unguarded. When she saw me, she waved and called, "They fall faster now." I smiled. "That's because they trust you," I called back. She laughed and I realized it was Mabel, the teenager who'd asked months ago if I ever regretted that Christmas night. She'd grown into herself, into kindness. She was the orchard's new caretaker. Her hands were stained with earth, not entitlement. The trees had chosen better this time. Inside, the morning light filtered through the library windows, gilding the room in calm. Mother sat in her usual chair by the fireplace, a knitted shawl draped around her shoulders. She was older now, visibly so, but her eyes, those fierce, calculating eyes, had softened into something that looked dangerously close to peace. She was writing again, her hand steady. I peeked at the first line of her latest letter before she caught me. "Dear Miriam Ash, you were right about the house. It was never ours to keep, only to continue." When she saw me reading, she smiled. "I'm writing to ghosts now," she said. "Do they answer?" I asked. "Always," she said. "Just not in words." Her pen didn't stop moving. "When I die," she added, matter of fact, "bury me under the window of the common room. I want to keep hearing the stories." I placed my hand on hers. "Then you'll never stop listening." We didn't talk about death again. We didn't need to. Some conversations complete themselves by being spoken once. Adrian changed more slowly, but he changed. He had turned the forge into a classroom. Boys and girls from the town came every week to learn the weight of metal and the grace of patience. Watching him there, instructing them gently, was like watching a storm remember how to be rain. He no longer wore jewelry. The only shine on him came from sweat and firelight. One afternoon, as the forge cooled and the students drifted away, I found him leaning against the doorframe, staring out at the orchard. "I used to think this place was my inheritance," he said. "Turns out it was my education." "You finally graduated," I teased. He smiled faintly. "No. I just stopped pretending I was the teacher." He handed me something wrapped in cloth. "Made this for you," he said. When I opened it, I found a small iron key. Hand-forged, heavy, beautiful. The bow was shaped like a tree, the teeth like roots. "I don't need the deed," he said quietly. "But I wanted to give something that couldn't be stolen." My throat tightened. "What does it open?" "Nothing," he said. "It just reminds me that doors only matter if they lead somewhere better." That key sits on my desk to this day. Not a symbol. A memory of the moment I realized my brother had become a man I no longer pitied. The house celebrated its quiet anniversaries in its own ways. The clock that once presided over our downfall now chimed differently, its tone less sharp, less lonely. Luz said she could tell when the house was happy because the kettle sang in tune with the wind. And on the anniversary of that Christmas night, the night Adrian told me to pack my bags, I decided to reclaim it. Not with revenge, but with ritual. We called it the night of return. No dinner guests in gowns this time. No silver cutlery, no speeches. Just family, staff, neighbors, and friends, all gathered in the dining room that had once been a battlefield of pride. The long table was but with mismatched plates donated by families from town. Every dish carried a story, one plate chipped by laughter, one painted by a child, one older than any of us. I stood at the head of the table only long enough to light a single candle. Then I passed it down the line. "Each of you," I said, "light one more." By the time the flame reached the end of the table, the entire room glowed. No chandeliers. No wealth. Just shared light. Mother leaned toward me and whispered, "Do you remember the first Christmas? The one that broke us?" "I remember," I said. She looked at the candle. "Then we're finally free from it." And she smiled, the same way she must have smiled before life taught her to calculate everything. For a moment, I saw the woman she might have been if the world had been kinder sooner. That night, after everyone left, I stayed in the dining room alone. The candles burned low, wax pooling like melted time. The quiet was deep and benevolent. I thought about all of it, the feud, the loss, the court, the covenant, the years of unraveling and restitching the fabric of what we'd been handed. And I realized something profound. Redemption isn't reversal. It's inheritance rewritten. The past doesn't disappear, it transforms. Grief doesn't fade, it ripens into meaning. Even pain, when tended to, can bloom into purpose. I turned off the last candle, whispering, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular. Maybe to the house. Maybe to time. Maybe to the part of me that finally stopped fighting the fire and learned to hold its warmth. The following spring, the county named the orchard a heritage site, not for its beauty but for its lesson. The plaque they installed read, "Here stood a house once divided by pride, now united by purpose." Proof that the walls we inherit can be remade into doors. Visitors came. Journalists came. A few old names from our circles came too, walking through the gates like tourists in someone else's piece. And one afternoon, one of them, Mrs. Caldwell, who'd once whispered gossip at that infamous Christmas dinner, approached me near the orchard. "I misjudged you," she said bluntly. "We all did." I smiled. "No, you judged exactly what you saw. You just didn't stay long enough to see what grew after." She hesitated, then touched the plaque gently. "Do you forgive us?" I thought about it. "I don't have to," I said. "The house It was quiet. Adrian began to teach at the local school part-time. Mother started a fund for young women writers. Luz and her sister opened a small bakery by the orchard gates, where every loaf was named after a virtue: mercy, courage, patience. And me, I stopped being the keeper of the house. I became its witness, its chronicler. I spent months compiling the letters, the deeds, the covenant, the photographs, Father's final words, Miriam's instructions, even the gossip clippings. I bound them together in a leather volume titled, "The House That Remembered." Not for profit, for memory. For those who'd need to know that stories don't end with eviction. Sometimes they begin there. One afternoon, as I sat in the study proofreading the final pages, I heard the sound of laughter from the orchard, children chasing each other between the trees. Their joy spilled through the window like sunlight with a heartbeat. And then above it all I heard something else. A voice calling my name. It was Mabel, running toward the house, breathless and beaming. "There's someone here to see you," she shouted. I stepped out onto the porch and froze. A woman stood by the gate, maybe in her 60s, hair silvered, posture proud but kind. She held a faded letter in her hand. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced," she said. "My name is Ruth Ashe. Miriam was my grandmother." For a moment time folded in on itself. She smiled softly. "I grew up hearing stories about this house. Left it in the care of strangers who'd one day become family. I wasn't sure she meant that literally until I read about your foundation." She held out the letter. This was hers. It was meant to be delivered when the house became what she'd hoped. "I think that time has come." The letter was old, the ink faint but legible. "To whoever keeps the light. I never meant for this house to be rich. I meant for it to be right. When it finally learns that difference, you'll know what to do next. Build another. Not of stone. Of kindness. Let this place be the seed, not the monument. M.A." Ruth smiled. "She'd be proud of you. Of all of you." I nodded, tears pricking my eyes. We were just caretakers of her sentence. "No," Ruth said. "You were the punctuation that gave it meaning." She stayed for dinner that night. And as we ate under the orchard's fairy lights, she told stories about Miriam's courage, how she fought to keep the land from being sold to developers, how she believed houses could heal people if they remembered how to serve them. Felt like coming full circle. The seed had bloomed, and the tree had found its gardener. When she left, I walked her to the gate. "You said your grandmother wanted us to build another," I said. "What do you think she meant?" She smiled. "I think she meant to share it. You don't have to build walls to build home. Sometimes all it takes is invitation." The word lingered long after she was gone. Invitation. So I did. We began building, not houses but programs, partnerships, spaces. We started a traveling initiative called the Open Table. Every season, the foundation would sponsor a shared meal in a different town, a harvest table, an orchard, a field, a parking lot, anywhere people needed to remember what it felt like to belong. We used our own funds to start it, but soon others joined. The idea spread. Churches, schools, even small communities began hosting their own version, some the Feast of Names, some simply Saturday supper. But all of them traced their origin to one house, one orchard, one Christmas that broke before it healed. And every letter that came in after that, every photo of tables in different towns, felt like a heartbeat from the same source. Years later, when I was old and my hair had gone the color of old paper, I walked through the orchard one last time. The trees bowed with fruit, their branches humming with bees. The house stood proud, gentle, unchanged in soul if not in form. Adrian's son was at the forge now. Mabel's daughter ran the foundation. The world had moved on and the house had stayed, anchored in truth, alive in purpose. And as I reached the edge of the meadow, I saw something carved into one of the benches near the old harvest table. 6 words. Small, simple, perfect. She kept it open after all. I laughed softly, my breath catching in the cool evening air. Yes, I whispered to the wind. We did, and for a fleeting second, I thought I heard Father's voice, carried by the rustle of leaves, gentle and certain. Welcome home, Eleanor. The orchard fell silent. The house glowed in the distance. And I knew redemption wasn't about erasing what was broken. It was about making sure the cracks let the light in. Because sometimes, brother, the truest revenge is rebuilding the world that tried to bury you, and filling it with grace. Winter returned like a familiar hymn, same refrain, different key. The orchard's branches lifted their bare hands to a pale sky, the forge exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke, and the house drew its warmth inward the way old friends lean in to hear each other better. It had been years since the night the table split us open. The wound had healed into a seam, visible if you knew where to look, useful because it held the cloth together. The mirror in the foyer had grown fond of mornings. It liked the way light took its time now, how people stopped to straighten their collars in their courage, how children stood on themselves taller than yesterday. Beneath it, the little plaque kept its promise. Look closely, some reflections arrive late, but they arrive. They did. Every day someone arrived. I had stopped counting anniversaries and started tending seasons. The calendar that once measured verdicts and filings now measured apples and onions, names in the basket, books borrowed and returned with notes tucked inside. This one made me call my sister. This one made me forgive a man who died 20 years ago. This one made me sleep. Mother's shawl hung over the common room chair. She had left it there one afternoon the way people leave a bookmark when they trust they will come back. When she didn't, we did not move it. The shawl had learned the shape of her shoulders, and the room had learned the truth of her late life, that elegance is mostly attention paid gently. We buried her under the reading room window as she asked. In spring, tulips pushed their red mouths up through grief and drank. On rainy days, children pressed their hands to the glass and waved. I like to think she waved back in a medium only angels study. Adrian kept the forge and, in time, the tender work of apology. Not the speech, the labor. He did not become a saint. Saints are bad at sweeping. He became a man whose hands forgot their old vocabulary for taking and learned the grammar of making. Sometimes he swore when heat bit his wrist. Sometimes he laughed at sparks. Sometimes he stood in the orchard at dusk and looked like a person listening to a language he had once refused to learn. The blacksmith grew old and began to leave early. Adrian locked up without ceremony, turned off the single bulb, and patted the anvil like a loyal dog. His son, Elias, named for the grandfather he had complicated and loved, took to iron as if iron had been waiting. There were failures too, because houses that become myths start making liars of the living. A program faltered when funds came late. A volunteer broke trust with a petty theft that felt larger than it was. A grant we wanted went to a shinier story. Pride put on its old perfume and tried a midnight stroll down the hall. We handled each with the same tools we had learned to trust: tea, ledgers, open doors, gloves. We added mending to the list of tasks on the kitchen chalkboard, and someone always wrote a name next to it by noon. On the longest night of the year, the common room hosted a vigil for people who had lost their way in different directions, through grief, through debt, through the narrow corridors of loneliness. We set the lamps low. We asked for no speeches. People brought objects to place on the central table: rings, photographs, a watch that had kept terrible time, a ribbon from a graduation no one attended, a folded apology whose recipient no longer had a mailing address. We stood in a circle and let the quiet do the speaking. When dawn arrived like a tired blessing, we put the objects back in their owners' hands. Some left them, trusting the house to hold what they could not yet lift. The foyer, for days afterward, smelt like winter citrus and mercy. The orchard learned a trick I had not encountered in books. It began fruiting early on a single tree each spring, a tree near the old split trunk. Mr. Harris shrugged when I asked. Some things are eager, he said. Don't scold them for wanting to be useful. We called it the first tree and let its apples go to people who came up the hill trembling from whatever they just survived. No forms. No proof. Just a paper bag, the kind that makes a soft punctuation on a wooden counter, and the sound of someone being told yes without conditions. In town, our reputation shifted from curiosity to habit. The bakery at the gate, Luz and her sister now laughing behind flour-dusted glass, ran out of bread by 10 on Saturdays and began making a second batch called Patience just for the noon crowd. The library branch requested more chairs. Our little bursary for apprentices who wanted to learn trades instead of debt grew into a corridor of doors we left unlocked on purpose. At council meetings, people stopped saying their house and started saying the house. Possessive pronouns learned humility. Of course, the glossy magazines came back. They always do. Like birds that discover your feeder and call it destiny. But the stories changed temperature. Now they wrote about branches, not chandeliers. They photographed hands, not dining rooms. Once, a young photographer asked if she could take my portrait by the mirror. Only, I said, if you take two, one now and one when your mother comes to visit. She did. The second one was better. The mirror likes company. The covenant lived quietly in the wall safe, the way a heart lives inside a rib cage. We took it out on the first Saturday of each new year and read it aloud in the common room. A child always asked what easement meant, and an old man always explained it as if giving away a family recipe. We recited Father's sentence too, because sentences that carry houses deserve an annual airing. People covered their mouths at the line, for the one who never asked but always earned, the way you cover a gasp when you are not embarrassed to be moved. At the end we did something Miriam did not require and law could not measure. We held up our hands like students and promised to keep the door open by doing one chore no one could see. We never compared lists. It worked anyway. I aged into the house the way Ivy learns a wall's logic. Hair thinned to the color of envelopes. Knees began keeping a weather calendar of their own. Some afternoons I napped in the common room, a blanket over my lap, a novel on my chest, the hum of the radiator telling me I had earned an hour. People were kind about waking me. There's soup, they'd whisper, or, they're arguing, come keep time, or once, a boy wants to return a book and a mistake. I sat up, smoothed my skirt, and went to wherever usefulness had set its table. One evening that smelled like dust and possibility, Ruth Ashe returned. She brought her granddaughter this time, a child who has been read to well. We walked the orchard and traded updates, hers about a community garden in her neighborhood, mine about the forge's new apprentices. At the old split trunk she stopped and placed both hands on the bark. She used to tell me, Ruth said softly, that a house doesn't love you back until you give it away. She looked at me sideways. Have you? I pointed at the meadow where tables had learned to lengthen on command. Continuously, I said. She laughed like an aunt and hugged me like a sister. As the years thinned, the house asked a question that was not quite about paper. What will you do with the part of you that cannot stay? It was not morbid, only mathematical. Bodies borrow time, houses learn to own it. I began writing the pages I had once promised in Act 7, and then kept postponing because life was busy being lived. I wrote the story as close to the floor as I could, which is to say without ornament that could slip and break. Names were named where they asked for accountability. Others were tucked behind kindly initials. I titled the book with the sentence the orchard had taught me, what stays after the light. I did not show it to anyone until a draft found its final breath and slept. When it woke, I carried it to the common room and read the beginning to the room that had edited me by living. When I finished, a child asked, "Does the house get to write a chapter too?" We pinned an empty page to the notice board with a brass tack. People filled it by evening. On the last spring I would see from this side, we hosted the biggest harvest table we had ever dared. 6 rows this time, not in a line but in a braid, so conversations would cross without collisions. We hung lanterns at a height that made even tall men bow just enough to remember they were among equals. The librarians wheeled out a cart and recited a poem at intermission. No metaphors for money, only for rain. Adrian's hands, scarred and certain, poured water. His son argued with a teenager about angle grinders the way the previous generation argued about Latin. Mother's shawl lay on the end chair like an absent-minded presence. As twilight practiced being night, we remembered names from the basket, the way a church says saints when it wants to keep time honest. Some names made us answer here even if nobody had said ours out loud. Later, when the meadow emptied and the lanterns learned restraint, I walked the perimeter one last time and let memory hold my elbow. The house glowed behind me, the particular gold that appears only when lamps remind wood that it was once a tree. At the gate, a young couple lingered, hesitant the way new parents are when they aren't sure the world is ready for their hope. They were not rich. They were brilliantly alive. "We brought nothing," the woman confessed, showing empty hands the way you might show a passport. "You brought yourselves," I said. The table noticed. She cried with relief and astonished me by thanking the gravel. People who survive scarcity learn to be grateful for surfaces. The last morning came without cruelty. I woke before dawn the way bodies learn to when they are done asking clocks for permission. The house was awake too, not bustling, only present. I walked it like a priest walks a nave, touching the backs of chairs and whispering to artifacts. In the study, I opened the safe, touched the deed, the covenant, Father's thunder and Miriam's plain law. I slid my palm over paper until the pad of my hand remembered what words can weigh. I left a note in the folio, for lines anyone could read without blushing. Be kind to the mornings. Keep soup unfashionable. Hang sentences on walls. If the door sticks, sand it. In the library, I wrote a second note and tucked it under the brass bell the children love to ring. Whoever rings this, remember, quiet is not the opposite of love. It is the hallway love uses. To find the right room. I took the mirror from the foyer with my eyes one more time. I did not try to memorize my face as it was. Mirrors are better archivists than I placed my left hand on the frame. It held me without gripping back. "Look closely," I whispered, "and forgive delay." I stood there until the glass convinced me I had arrived. When I stepped outside, dawn had set its table. A softness hung over the meadow as if light had decided to be gentle today. The orchard offered its first blossoms and did not ask who deserved them. I sat on the bench with the 6 words carved into it. She kept it open after all, and laughed out loud at the audacity of being understood. Mr. Harris appeared with a thermos and 2 cups. He poured without comment. We watched a fox cross the far fence line with a confidence that made me glad to be robbed of nothing. "You did it," he said eventually, as if recording minutes. "We did it," I corrected. He nodded once. Always was we. Inside, feet began to measure the floors. A child somewhere squealed at a book like it contained a puppy. The kettle remembered its old song. Iron answered wood in the carriage house. The day rehearsed usefulness, and usefulness agreed to show up without applause. When my breath labored, it did so with decorum. I lay down on the common room settee, the one with the tiny snag I never fixed because imperfection told the truth. Luz pressed a cool cloth to my forehead and said a prayer in a language the room already spoke. Adrian sat on the floor beside me because chairs felt impolite. "You made me a man," he said, which was not true but was beautiful to hear. "You made yourself one," I answered, because accuracy is love's twin. He laughed, then cried without turning away. People gathered but did not crowd. The house managed proximity like a conductor who finally got the orchestra to listen to each other. I thought of father. Not the portrait, the man who wrote one good sentence and a handful of almosts. I thought of mother. Not the hostess, the woman whose last chapter forgave the preface. I thought of Miriam, stern and kind in clauses. I thought of children and ladders and rosemary in a tumbler and a paper bird that once promised better dreams. The room smelled like bread and a storm 3 counties away. I did the arithmetic of a life and found the remainder small enough to fold. "Leave it open," I said to whoever was nearest, which turned out to be everyone. The front door, the mirror, the ledger, the possibility. They promised with faces. Promises are best recorded there. I did not fall asleep. I arrived elsewhere. The house kept going because that is what houses do when you teach them how. In the weeks that followed, grief walked the rooms in socks, trying not to bang any pans. The house let it, the way a good host pretends not to notice when someone needs to cry by the sink. People brought flowers and bread and stories. The stories were the richest, hairline cracks of memory gilded by telling. They tacked them to the notice board until it had to become a book. Elias forged a small iron leaf and nailed it to the bench beside the 6 words. The leaf will outlast the bench. That is how tribute should be, quieter than the person it loves. Acting as we had rehearsed for years, The foundation named a new steward. Not a successor, a circle. Mabel took the chair. Elias kept the hammer. The librarians kept the hours. Luz kept the starter alive. Mr. Harris retired twice and came back because land keeps old men honest. On the first Saturday of the new year, the covenant was read with more pauses than usual and exactly the right number of tears. Someone pointed to the note in the folio, "Sand the door," and the room laughed. The door did stick that morning. Someone fetched paper, someone fetched patience. The door learned manners again. Adrian spoke last. He stood where I once stood and where Father had planned to, and he looked like a sentence finally given its period. "I thought this house was mine," he said. "Then I thought it was hers. She taught me it is ours, which is to say it belongs to the work it does." He lifted his hands, scarred and steady. Hands help. He sat down, embarrassed by eloquence, which is the finest way to end a speech. The longest act in any life is the part lived by everyone else after you finish your lines. They performed it without theater. The table kept lengthening. The first tree kept giving bags to the trembling. The night of return turned into a season of arrivals. Immigrants with recipes they taught the kitchen without writing them down. Widowers who learned to sit at the end of a bench without apologizing for their sorrow. Teenagers who argued about poems and torque in the same hour and discovered no one needed to grade either. Once, a stranger came up the drive and asked to see the deed. The librarian led him, gently, to the common room and handed him a bowl of stew. After he finished, he did not need to see the paper. Years later, a child tracing letters with a finger on the mirror asked the question that restored me across time. Who opened it the first time? Mabel smiled, pointed not at the portraits, not at the safe, but at the bench under the window and the shawl still folded on the chair and the door sanded smooth. "We did," she said. "All of us. That's the only way doors learn." The story left the hill on purpose and set tables in towns we would never visit. Photographs arrived of parking lots transformed into banquets, gymnasiums turned into reading rooms, harvests carried in pickup trucks to streets with more need than maps. In each picture I could find our house if I looked. In a hinge that didn't squeal, in a name read softly, in a child shown to a shelf and told take the one you want. That's what shelves are for. Truth travels best when it doesn't pack luggage, only permission. On the 100th Saturday, they hung a small frame beside Father's sentence, a page from what stays after the light that had made the rounds in classrooms and kitchens. We are not saved by what we own. We are restored by what we keep open. Doors, ledgers, tables, afternoons, the kind of quiet that lets a person arrive. Without a story practiced in self-defense. Under it, another brass tack held a list that changed weekly, tasks nobody will praise. That list was always full. A child once wrote Feed the Fox the story where he doesn't have to steal. Someone left a hot dog under the ash tree that night. The fox took it, then paused, looking toward the house like an animal doing math. Not every ending is clean. The glossy magazines eventually forgot us again because novelty is their species of weather. A distant cousin tried to sell a slander and found no buyers. A donor wanted naming rights and was offered a broom instead. He took it. Sweeping, he discovered, made his shoulders honest. A storm cracked a branch. A plumber cracked a joke. A grant cracked open a new annex with windows that taught sun to be generous in winter. The house learned new creaks. The forge learned new apprentices. The orchard forgot no one. On the last page of the covenant, in a corner we had never noticed, a sentence emerged what felt like all at once, as if ink needs time to ripen. A house is a promise that somebody kept. They painted it small above the kitchen door where only staff and courage look. People nodded when they saw it, and then dried their hands and carried on. If this were spectacle, the curtain would fall to applause. But this is aftermath, and aftermath is daily bread. So the scene continues. A front door that sticks less often, a mirror that tells the truth without flattery, a meadow that will never fit in a photograph because photographs can't capture the sound of names read softly, a bench that seats one more, a forge that treats stubbornness like a metal you can make into a hinge if you heat it with enough humility. And, somewhere near the study, a wall safe with paper that never learned to be arrogant. What stays after the light? The same things that were there before the storm, but sorted rightly: work before pride, names before crests, soup before speeches, sentences before signatures, the soft click of a latch whose hinge has been tended, the feeling of a door that opens without asking for whom. And if you listen from the orchard at dusk, you can still hear it, The house breathing, the town answering, and tucked under the wind's sleeve, the faintest thread of a woman's laughter, the kind that belongs to someone who was told to pack her bags and decided instead to unpack courage, fold it into drawers, and label the trunk she left behind not linens but light. The door is open. The bench remembers. The mirror forgives delay. Come in. It's your turn to keep it. They said I'd lost everything that Christmas night, the home, the family, the name. But they were wrong. Because sometimes losing what was never yours is how truth begins to recognize you. Years passed. The house still breathes. Its doors still whisper open. The forge still sings. And every spring the orchard drops its apples early, as if remembering the woman who once refused to leave. If you listen at dawn, you'll hear it. The hum of a place that has forgiven itself. The echo of laughter on the stairs. The clink of a cup placed gently on old wood. And maybe if the light falls just right, you'll see her reflection in the foyer mirror. Not as a ghost, but as a keeper who never left. Because in the end, revenge turned to grace. And grace built something no storm could take. The house remained. And it stayed open. For everyone who ever needed to